There is a moment in season 3 of The Simpsons where Homer sells the family television set not as a punchline. He sells it that's because he wants so badly to be a good father that he will give up the one thing most associated with him to pay for family therapy, that Homer has not existed for roughly 25 years. Meanwhile, Family Guy gets canceled twice, comes back both times, and in 2024 becomes the third most watched show in the entire United States across every streaming platform in the country. These two shows are still being compared as if the answer is obvious. It is, just not in the direction most people think. Today I want to prove across 12 sections that when you look at both shows honestly as complete works and as living television programs producing new content right now, Family Guy is the better show, not the more important show, the better one. Welcome back to Yellowfan, or welcome if you are new. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of thing. Let us get into it. The title trap, what you're actually comparing here, is the thing about this debate that nobody wants to say out loud. When most people argue that The Simpsons is better than Family Guy, they are not actually comparing the two shows. They are comparing Family Guy, the show that exists right now, airing new episodes, being watched by millions of people every single week, to a version of The Simpsons that stopped existing somewhere around the year 2000. They are comparing a living show to a memory, and that is not a fair fight. That is not even a fight at all. That is just nostalgia dressed up as an argument. So before anything else, we need to agree on what we are actually talking about. We are talking about two shows that both exist today, two shows that both aired new episodes in 2025, two shows that both got renewed for multiple additional seasons, two shows that are both available to stream right now tonight if you wanted to put something on while you fall asleep. And when you compare those two shows, the ones that actually exist, not the one that lives in your memory from when you were 9 years old, the argument changes completely. The Simpsons premiered on December 17th, 1989. It is now in its 36th season. It has aired over 800 episodes, and across those 36 seasons, the show's episode ratings on IMDb, one of the largest public databases of audience scores in the world, tell a very clear story. In the first 9 seasons, episodes regularly scored between 7.5 and 9 out of 10. By season 25, episodes were regularly scoring between 5.5 and 6.5 out of 10. By the time the show hit its most recent seasons, average viewership had dropped from around 14 million people per episode during its peak years all the way down to approximately 1.2 million people per episode. That is not a minor dip. That is a collapse spread out over so many years that most people never noticed it happening. One writer described the decline as being like a slow fade, so gradual that you did not realize it was occurring until you looked back and could not recognize the show you were watching. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, a full decade after The Simpsons. It was not around as long, but it has been on long enough. By 2025, it was in its 23rd season. It had aired over 400 episodes, and here is where the numbers get interesting. In 2024, according to Nielsen Media Research, the company that has been measuring what Americans watch on television and streaming for decades, Family Guy was the third most watched show in the entire United States across all streaming platforms. Not the third most watched animated show, the third most watched show, period. Across everything on every service. It accumulated 42.44 billion viewing minutes on Hulu in a single year. To put that in some kind of scale, Grey's Anatomy, one of the most popular shows in television history, with over 20 seasons of episodes, came in second at 47.85 billion minutes. Family Guy was right behind it. The Simpsons did not appear in the top 10. In the first half of 2025, Family Guy ranked 4th overall in Nielsen's streaming charts, behind only Bluey, Grey's Anatomy, and NCIS. During one specific week in late August 2024, Family Guy accumulated more than 1 billion minutes of viewing in 7 days, a single week, making it the third most streamed series that entire week. In December 2025, Disney confirmed that Family Guy had surpassed 1 billion hours streamed on Disney Plus across the full year of 2025. Not minutes, hours, 1 billion of them. And in January 2026, Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, received what Nielsen called the inaugural Streaming Icon of the Year award, given to recognize a creator whose shows generated more combined viewing than any other. His shows, primarily Family Guy and American Dad, produced over 60 billion viewing minutes across all platforms in 2025 alone. That number, if you tried to watch it all yourself, would take you roughly 114,000 years. None of this means the show is perfect. None of this means every episode is good. What it means is that when people say nobody watches Family Guy anymore, or that The Simpsons is still the more relevant show, or that Family Guy has fallen off, the data does not support any of those claims, not even a little. Now here is where the honest version of this conversation gets complicated. The Simpsons, during a specific window of time roughly from season 3 through season 8, was genuinely one of the greatest things ever put on television. This is not a small claim. Time magazine named it the greatest television series of the 20th century. Not the greatest animated series, the greatest series across all genres of an entire century. The writing during those years was so sharp and so layered that academics have written papers about it. The humor worked on 3 or 4 levels simultaneously. The characters felt like real people. Episodes that were supposed to be silly were somehow also emotionally devastating. It was for a period of about 5 to 6 years, operating at a level of quality that almost no television show before or since has matched. That version of The Simpsons deserves every piece of praise it has ever received. But here is the problem. That version of The Simpsons ended somewhere between 25 and 30 years ago. The show has now aired more episodes after its golden period than it aired during that golden period, by a significant margin. The show that exists today in its 36th season, producing episodes that are averaging 1.2 million viewers and scoring between 5 and 7 on IMDb, is not that show. It shares a name with that show. It shares the same characters, the same yellow color scheme, the same opening sequence. But the critics who have studied the show's decline most carefully have a phrase for this. They say that Golden Era Simpsons and post-Golden Era Simpsons are in every meaningful way 2 different series that happen to share a title. So when someone says The Simpsons is better than Family Guy, the first question worth asking is which Simpsons? If the answer is The Simpsons of 1993, of Marge versus the monorail and Homer at the bat and last exit to Springfield, yes, that show is better than Family Guy. It is better than almost everything. But that is a show that does not exist anymore. You cannot watch new episodes of it. You can only revisit the old ones. And revisiting old episodes of a show that ended a quarter century ago is not the same thing as the show being good now. Family Guy, by contrast, has been 4th in national streaming charts in 2025. It was just renewed in April 2025 for an additional 4 seasons, all the way through season 27 in what Fox and Disney called a mega deal. A new spin-off series focused on the character Stewie was given a 2-season order in March 2026, set to premiere during the 2027 to 2028 season. The show is not dying. The show is not struggling. The show is, by almost every measurable standard available, more watched and more commercially vital right now than The Simpsons is. The comparison most people are making is not really a comparison at all. It is a monument. People have built a monument to what The Simpsons used to be, and they're measuring every other show against that monument rather than against the actual living program that airs on Fox on Sunday nights. And the living program that airs on Fox on Sunday nights in its current form is not that monument. It is a show that has been declining for roughly 25 years. It is a show whose creator, Matt Groening, has moved on to other projects. It is a show whose original writing staff, the people who made it what it was, largely departed before the year 2000. It is a show that is renewed every 2 years, not because audiences are desperate for more of it, but because it is a franchise asset that Disney and Fox have too much money invested in to stop making. That is a very different thing from what it used to be. And pretending otherwise in order to win an argument about which show is better is not a real argument. It is just a feeling dressed up as one. Family Guy has its own problems. It has had bad seasons, bad episodes, and creative drifts that frustrated even its most loyal fans. No honest version of this essay is going to pretend otherwise, and we will get into those problems in detail as we go. But when you look at the two shows as they have actually existed, not as you remember them, not as they were at their absolute best, but as complete works across their full runs and as programs that are actively producing new content right now. The case for Family Guy is stronger than the conventional wisdom admits. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question is not which show had the better 5 years, the question is which show is better. And that question requires looking at everything, which means the next thing we need to talk about is the specific moment The Simpsons stopped being The Simpsons, and why the people responsible for making it great were already long gone before most viewers noticed anything was wrong. Section 2. The Writing Room Collapse, How The Simpsons Lost Its Voice. There is a version of the story of The Simpsons' decline that sounds like a mystery. A show that was once the greatest thing on television slowly, quietly, became something much worse over the course of about a decade, and nobody can quite explain why. Critics debate which season it started, fans argue about which episode was the turning point. The conversation loops back on itself forever, with everyone pointing at slightly different moments and slightly different causes, and no clear conclusion ever landing. But it is not actually a mystery, it has a documented, traceable, factual explanation, and that explanation lives inside the writer's room. To understand what happened, you first have to understand what The Simpsons was built on. The show did not become great because of the concept. A yellow cartoon family living in a fake American town is not by itself a remarkable idea. It became great because of a specific group of people who sat in a room together and made it great. And the single most important thing about that group of people is that almost all of them were gone before the end of the 1990s. Sam Simon is the name that does not appear in the story as often as it should. Matt Groening created the characters. James L. Brooks produced the show and gave it its emotional grounding. But Sam Simon is the person who built the writer's room, assembled the original staff, and created the system that turned a sketch concept into one of the most carefully constructed comedies in television history. Simon was the show's creative supervisor from the beginning, and he is the reason the early seasons had the specific quality they had. He was the person who understood how to layer a joke so that it worked on the surface for a casual viewer, and worked again differently for someone paying closer attention. He built the machine. Simon left the show before season 5. His departure was not clean or quiet. He had a difficult relationship with Matt Groening and with James L. Brooks, and the tensions eventually made it impossible for him to continue. He left with a financial settlement that paid him for the rest of his life, and he spent much of the money he earned on animal rights causes before his death in 2015. But the point for our purposes is simple. The person who built the engine of The Simpsons left the building before the show had even finished its 4th season. The original writing staff that Simon assembled was genuinely extraordinary. John Swartzwelder wrote more episodes of The Simpsons than any other single writer in the show's history. John Vitti, who longtime writer George Meyer said usually invented the best lines in any given episode, even when other writers received the credit, was there from the start. George Meyer himself was there, and his contribution to the show's quality is hard to overstate. Jeff Martin was there. Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski, who wrote together as a pair, were there. And then there were Al Jean and Mike Rice. Al Jean and Mike Rice are the two people most directly responsible for what most fans remember as the greatest seasons of The Simpsons. They had been writing together since they were students at Harvard, where they had both worked on the Harvard Lampoon. They became the show's showrunners starting with season 3, which means they were the people with final creative control over every episode produced during their tenure. John later said that one of the reasons fans and critics regard seasons 3 and 4 as the show's best is that the show had already established itself in seasons 1 and 2, which allowed Gibbs, John, and Rice to push deeper into character and give the stories more weight. Another writer named Bill Oakley put it more directly. He said that Mike and Al are responsible for the best thing that ever appeared on television, which was the third season of The Simpsons. Another writer, Jay Kogan, said that those years with Al Jean and Mike Rice running it were pretty darn good, and then the ones after that maybe not so much. Jean and Rice left after season 4. They left to create their own show, an animated series called The Critic for ABC. They did not leave because anything was wrong. They left because they had the opportunity to make something of their own, and they took it. When they walked out the door, they took with them the specific creative vision that had guided the show through its best years, and they were not alone in leaving. Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski had already gone before season 4 was even finished. Jeff Martin left around the same time. John Vitti departed. By the time season 5 began production, the room that had made seasons 3 and 4 was largely empty of the people who had actually made those seasons. The departures did not stop there. George Meyer, who many people who worked on the show regarded as the single funniest writer in the room, continued for a while but left in 2004. For most of the 1990s, the show cycled through new showrunners roughly every 2 seasons. David Merkin took over for seasons 5 and 6, then Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein for seasons 7 and 8, then Mike Scully for seasons 9 through 12. Each change brought a different creative sensibility. Some of these showrunners did better work than others, but none of them were the original team, and none of them had the same relationship with the characters, the same understanding of what made the show work at the deepest level that the people who had built it from scratch possessed. Mike Scully's tenure, covering seasons 9 through 12, is the period that most longtime fans point to as the beginning of the real damage. Chris Suellentrop, writing for Slate, described what happened to the show under Scully this way. The show became, well, a cartoon. He wrote that episodes which once would have ended with Homer and Marge bicycling into the sunset now ended with Homer blowing a tranquilizer dart into Marge's neck. He said the show was still funny, but had not been genuinely touching in years. Scully himself, when asked in 2007 how the show had sustained its run for so long, made a joke that landed harder than he probably intended. He said, "Lower your quality standards. Once you have done that, you can go on forever." That line is a joke, but it is also the most honest description of what happened to The Simpsons that anyone involved with the show has ever offered in public. Al Jean came back to the show permanently, becoming showrunner again starting with season 13 in 2001, a position he has held ever since. This sounds on paper like good news. The man who helped make seasons 3 and 4 the best seasons in the show's history came back to run the show. But a writer returning to a program 20 years after its best days is not the same as that program returning to its best days. Jean came back to a show that had already been through 5 different showrunners, had lost most of its original staff, and was producing more than 20 episodes per season every year without a clear creative purpose. Former writers who worked under Gene's later tenure have described the atmosphere using words like autopilot. They said the tone had become too sentimental. They said episodes were just being cranked out. Jean himself acknowledged the difficulty honestly. When he returned to the showrunner role, he said in an interview that it was a great job with a lot of responsibility, and then added, "The hardest thing at this point is just thinking of fresh ideas." That is a genuinely difficult admission from someone in his position. It is also the clearest possible sign that the well had run dry. Now compare this to what Seth MacFarlane did with Family Guy's writing staff. When Family Guy was canceled the first time, and then the second time, and then brought back, the constant disruption to the show's production forced MacFarlane to rebuild his team repeatedly. He said this himself, and he framed it not as a disaster, but as something that had unexpected benefits. His exact words were, "One of the positive aspects of Family Guy constantly being pulled off the air is that we were always having to restaff writers. Every time the show came back, new voices came into the room. New perspectives came with them. The show was not allowed to go on autopilot because going on autopilot had gotten it canceled before. The Simpsons never had that experience. The Simpsons was never canceled. It was never forced to prove itself again. It was never put in a position where the people making it had to rebuild from scratch and ask themselves what the show was actually supposed to be. It just kept going. And the people who originally knew what it was supposed to be were long gone by the time the questions started piling up. There is one more thing worth understanding about how writers' rooms work on long-running shows, and it matters here. The writers who work on The Simpsons today are significantly older than the writers who worked on it in the 1990s because the staff has had very little turnover under Al Jean's tenure. One analysis of the show's writing staff history noted that the lack of turnover means the current writing team is considerably older than it was during the golden years, and that the room no longer has the energy or the diversity of perspective that comes from young writers bringing in new observations about the world. The Simpsons writers' room in the 1990s was full of people who had recently graduated from places like Harvard and who were writing about life as they were currently living it. The Simpsons writers' room today is full of people who have been working on the same show for 15 to 20 years and who are, by any reasonable description, writing about life from the inside of a very comfortable and very familiar bubble. Family Guy does not have a perfect writer's room either. No show does, but Family Guy has not been running long enough to calcify in the same way, and the show's rocky history, the cancellations, the revivals, the constant restaffing has kept it from the kind of slow creative suffocation that comes from doing the same thing for so long that nobody in the building can remember what it felt like to do it differently. The Simpsons lost its voice because the people who gave it that voice walked out the door before the 1990s were over. What remained was the structure, the characters, the brand, all the scaffolding of something great, without the thing that made it great still inside. That is not a failure of any individual. It is simply what happens when a machine outlives the mechanics who built it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, but losing the writing staff is only part of the story, because even the best writing staff in the world cannot fix a problem that is baked into the characters themselves. And The Simpsons has a character problem so severe that the television industry actually named a concept after it. A concept that describes exactly what happened to every single major person in Springfield, one by one, across 36 seasons. That is what we need to talk about next. Section 3. Flanderization. The Simpsons invented a term for its own worst problem. There is a word that people use on the internet, in television criticism, in academic writing about media, and in everyday conversation about storytelling. The word is Flanderization. It means the process of taking a character who started out as a full, real, complicated person and slowly reducing them season by season until the only thing left is one single trait repeated over and over forever. A character who was once a whole person becomes a walking punchline. A character who once surprised you becomes completely predictable. A character who once felt like someone you might actually know becomes a cartoon version of themselves. That word came from The Simpsons. Specifically, it came from a character on The Simpsons named Ned Flanders. The website TV Tropes, which documents storytelling patterns across all of film and television, coined the term Flanderization specifically because of what happened to Ned Flanders over the course of the show's run. The fact that a show gave its name to a concept describing one of the worst things that can happen to a character in a long-running series is already worth sitting with for a moment, but what makes it genuinely remarkable is this. Ned Flanders is not even close to the most extreme example of this problem on The Simpsons. He is just the one they named it after. Almost every single major character on the show has been through the same process. The show did not just produce one famous example of Flanderization, it produced an entire factory of it. Start with Ned Flanders himself, because he is where the word comes from and his story makes the pattern clear. When Ned was introduced in the early seasons of the show, he was Homer's neighbor at 742 Evergreen Terrace. He was a genuinely good person, he was kind, patient, generous, and he happened to be a devout Christian. His faith was one part of who he was among many other parts. He ran a shop called the Leftorium that sold products for left-handed people. He was a good father to his sons Rod and Todd. He had a strained relationship with his own parents. He had suppressed anger that occasionally broke through the surface. He was, in other words, a complete person who also happened to go to church every Sunday. As the seasons went on, the show kept turning up the dial on his Christianity and turning down the dial on everything else. The Leftorium stopped mattering. His relationship with his sons became primarily a vehicle for religious jokes. His strained relationship with his parents was explored briefly and then set aside. By the later seasons of the show, almost every single line Ned Flanders speaks is about God, the Bible, sin, or church. He does not have conversations anymore. He delivers religious punchlines. Wikipedia's own entry on Flanderization describes him as having been simplified into a religious extremist whose Christianity was his primary defining characteristic, where before it had simply been one part of a more complete picture. Now here is the important thing. Ned Flanders is not the worst example of this on The Simpsons. He is the example they named the concept after, but multiple other characters on the same show were hit harder. Homer Simpson is the central case. Homer is the main character of the entire series, and what happened to him over 36 seasons is one of the clearest examples of a show slowly destroying its own most important asset. In season 1, Homer is a specific kind of person. He is embarrassed by his family. He is a man who cares deeply about being a good provider and a good father, even when he falls short of that. In the season 1 episode called There's No Disgrace Like Home, Homer is so embarrassed by how his family behaves at his boss's party that he sells the family television set to pay for them all to go to therapy. He sells the TV. The man who later seasons would define almost entirely by his love of television and his laziness sold the television because he cared that much about being a good father. In the season 1 episode called Homer's Odyssey, Homer loses his job at the nuclear plant after an accident. He falls into such a deep depression about failing as a provider that he considers ending his own life. He then becomes the plant's safety inspector because he genuinely cares about the safety of the workers and the community. That is the Homer Simpson of the first season, a man who cares so much about doing right by his family that losing his job nearly breaks him and who turns that pain into something constructive. By season 11, the same character had become, in the words of multiple critics and in the documented analysis on TV tropes, a dangerously stupid and aggressive man with no emotional control, who regularly burst into tears and threw tantrums. His love for his family, which was the engine that powered every story in the early seasons, was functionally gone. The thing that made him worth watching, the thing that made him funny and also real and also occasionally heartbreaking, had been stripped away to make room for easier jokes. The show knew this was happening. In the season 7 episode called The Simpsons 138th Episode Spectacular, which was a clip show hosted by the character Troy McClure, the show included a letter from a viewer named Professor Lawrence Pierce of the University of Chicago. The letter said, "I think Homer gets stupider every year." Troy McClure's response was, "That is not a question, Professor, but we will let the viewers judge for themselves." And then the show played a montage of Homer being progressively more stupid across multiple seasons. The Simpsons was making fun of its own most serious problem while the problem was still actively happening, which is either very self-aware or a sign that the people making the show recognized the issue and did not know how to fix it. Bart Simpson went through his own version of this. In the early seasons, Bart was described by the show's own writers as being brilliant but lazy. He was a kid who did badly in school not because he was dumb, but because he was easily distracted and never bothered to study. He had a conscience. He had limits. There were things he would not do, lines he would not cross, because somewhere underneath all the troublemaking, he was a decent kid who cared about the people in his life. Later seasons turned him into something closer to a character who exists purely to cause destruction, with very little conscience left and a level of stupidity that matched the postseason 10 version of Homer. The complexity was gone. What replaced it was noise. Lisa Simpson's case is described by many critics and by the people who document these patterns most carefully as possibly the single most extreme example of Flanderization in the entire history of television. That is a significant claim. Lisa began the show as a complicated, emotionally rich child. She was smart, yes, but she was also rebellious in her own quiet ways. She had a sardonic sense of humor, she experienced real loneliness and real joy, and she was not defined by any single thing. Over the course of the show's run, she was reduced almost entirely to one characteristic. She is the smart, progressive one who is right about everything and tells everyone else they are wrong. Every episode featuring Lisa in a prominent role eventually becomes about this single trait. She has no surprises left. You know what Lisa is going to think about any situation before she opens her mouth, because the show stopped giving her the ability to think anything unexpected years ago. Apu Nahasa Pima Petalon, the owner of the Quickie Mart, started as a character with genuine depth. He was a man who had earned a PhD but ended up running a convenience store, which was its own quiet commentary on the gap between ambition and reality. He had a complicated relationship with his job, his country of origin, and his sense of identity. As the seasons went on, the show leaned harder and harder into racial stereotypes connected to his Indian background. The complexity evaporated, and he eventually became so problematic as a character that the show quietly removed him from episodes entirely rather than fix what had gone wrong. Chief Wiggum, Springfield's police chief, began as a corrupt but functional authority figure with occasional moments of genuine competence and even occasional moments of decency. He became, over time, a completely useless character whose only purpose is to be wrong about everything and fail at his job in the most obvious possible ways. The nuance that made him an interesting part of the show's world in its early seasons no longer exists. Now here is where Family Guy fits into this picture. Family Guy has not been immune to this problem. The website Wikipedia's entry on Flanderization specifically cites Brian Griffin as a notable example outside of The Simpsons. Brian began the show as a dry, sardonic character who acted as a grounding voice against Peter's chaos. Over time, his arrogance and his habit of pushing his political opinions on everyone around him became his dominant traits. That is a real criticism, and it is a valid one. But there is a crucial difference between what happened to Brian Griffin and what happened to Homer Simpson, Ned Flanders, Bart Simpson, Lisa Simpson, Apu, and Chief Wiggum all at the same time. Brian is a secondary character. He is important to the show, and he is one of its most recognizable figures, but he is not the center of the series in the way that Homer is the center of The Simpsons. When a secondary character gets Flanderized, it weakens some episodes and makes certain storylines less interesting. When your main character gets Flanderized, the entire show loses its foundation. Homer Simpson is not a secondary character who got a little one note over time. Homer Simpson is the character the entire show is built around, and the reduction of Homer from a flawed but loving father into a stupid, selfish, consequence-free cartoon is the single biggest reason watching new Simpsons episodes feels hollow in a way that watching older ones never did. You are not watching Homer anymore. You are watching a thing that looks like Homer and sounds like Homer and shares Homer's name, but who has had everything that made Homer interesting removed and replaced with easy stupidity. Stewie Griffin, one of Family Guy's most important characters, went through a significant change across the show's run. He began as a homicidal infant with a plan for world domination. As the seasons went on, the world domination plots faded and Stewie became more of a scene-stealing personality than a genuine villain. Many fans noticed this shift, but what replaced the villain Stewie was something arguably more interesting, a complex, emotionally vulnerable character whose relationship with Brian became one of the most genuine emotional threads in the show. The change was not random deterioration, it was a deliberate creative choice that opened up new stories. That is a different thing from what happened to Homer Simpson, whose deterioration opened up nothing except cheaper jokes. There is one more piece of this that matters. The Simpsons gave a name to a problem that has since been identified in shows all across television. That name exists because The Simpsons was the most visible and most discussed example of the problem when TV tropes first defined it. The show did not just suffer from Flanderization, it suffered from it so thoroughly across so many of its characters at the same time that it became the defining example of what Flanderization looks like at its worst. A show that destroys one main character through this process is in trouble. A show that destroys its entire main cast through this process over and over, season after season, for 3 decades, is a show that has been running on fumes for longer than most of its current viewers have been alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And yet, The Simpsons keeps going, which raises a question worth asking. If the writing staff is gone and the characters have been hollowed out, what exactly is keeping the show alive? The answer to that turns out to be a lot less flattering than most people realize, and it has everything to do with what Family Guy had to do to survive that The Simpsons never once had to face. Section 4, the resurrection test. Family Guy earned its audience. The Simpsons inherited one. There is a test that very few television shows have ever been put through, and almost none have passed. The test goes like this: your show gets canceled, the network decides it is not worth keeping, the time slot gets taken away, the production shuts down, and the people who worked on it move on to other things. And then somehow the show comes back anyway. Not because the network had a change of heart on its own, not because someone in a boardroom decided to take a chance, but because the audience refused to let it die. Because real people with no financial stake in the outcome cared enough about the show to fight for it. Family Guy passed that test twice. That fact alone separates Family Guy from The Simpsons in a way that no debate about episode quality or character writing can touch. The Simpsons has never been canceled. It has never had to prove that its audience still wants it. It has never been in a position where the people watching it had to actively do something to keep it alive. The show has simply continued season after season, renewal after renewal, not because of demonstrated demand, but because it is one of the most valuable brand properties in the history of American television, and the companies that own it have never had a financial reason to stop producing it. That is a very different kind of survival than what Family Guy went through. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. It aired following Super Bowl 33 on Fox, which meant its first episode was seen by one of the largest television audiences of the entire year. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old. He was the youngest executive producer of a major primetime show in television history at that point. The show got off to a reasonable start and settled into a slot on Fox's Sunday night lineup, sitting between The Simpsons and The X-Files, two of the most popular shows on television at the time. For a brand new animated series, that was about as good a position as you could ask for. Then in May 2000, after season 2, Fox canceled it. The official reason given was competitive time slots that made it difficult for the show to build the kind of consistent ratings the network needed. The cancellation was brief. Fox reversed course and gave the show a third season, which aired from 2001 to 2002. But at the end of that third season, the show was canceled again. This time it felt permanent. Production stopped. MacFarlane, by his own account, believed the show was completely finished. He said he thought it was done. He moved on. He began developing another show called American Dad with a different creative team. The show sat in cancellation for 3 years. 3 years during which no new episodes were produced, no renewal was announced, and by any normal understanding of how television works, the story of Family Guy should have ended. What happened instead is one of the most unusual stories in the history of American entertainment. When Family Guy reruns began airing on Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, something unexpected happened. The show found an audience that had not been there the first time around. Adult Swim ran programming late at night targeting teenagers and young adults who were up past midnight, and that demographic took to Family Guy in a way that the original Fox audience never quite had. The reruns were not just watched, they were watched repeatedly, enthusiastically, by people who had never seen the show during its original run, and who were now discovering it for the first time in syndication. The ratings for the reruns were genuinely strong. The show was, in a real sense more popular in syndication than it had ever been when it was actually in production. At the same time, something else was happening. The DVD market for television in the early 2000s was still relatively new. Studios had started releasing full seasons of television shows on DVD, and audiences were buying them. Family Guy's first 3 seasons were released on DVD, and the sales numbers were extraordinary. According to Steve Feldstein, who was a Fox Home Entertainment executive at the time, the DVD sales revealed a fan base that had been lying dormant. He told the New York Times that the base brought a whole new group with it, and that the numbers led the network to take a second look at the show. Behind only The Chappelle Show, the 2 best-selling television DVDs of that period were The Simpsons and Family Guy, then both Fox animated products. The numbers were impossible to ignore, and then there were the fans themselves. Over 100,000 people signed petitions demanding that Family Guy be brought back. Online communities dedicated to the show organized, wrote letters, and made noise in every way they could. This was 2003 and 2004, before social media existed in any recognizable form, which makes it more impressive. People found ways to make their voices heard using the internet tools that existed at the time, and the collective weight of that effort, combined with the DVD sales and the Adult Swim ratings, eventually became too large for Fox to dismiss. In 2004, Fox announced that Family Guy would return. The network ordered 35 new episodes. Season 4 premiered in May 2005, 3 years after the show had been declared dead, and it pulled in strong ratings. MacFarlane acknowledged in interviews that he had genuinely not expected it to come back. He was surprised. He was also, by his own description, in a complicated position creatively, because the cancellations had forced him to rebuild his writing staff multiple times, which meant the show that returned in 2005 was not exactly the same show that had been canceled in 2002. It was built from the same foundation, but with new voices added, which gave it a slightly different texture and energy. The Season 4 premiere episode acknowledged the situation directly, and it did so in the most Family Guy way possible. Peter Griffin, talking to his family at the beginning of the episode, informs them that they have been canceled because Fox needed to empty its schedule for new shows. He then lists off a series of other Fox shows that had been canceled recently. The episode was both a self-aware joke about the show's own history and a pointed comment about Fox's habit of canceling things that had not yet found their footing. The show could laugh about being canceled because it had survived being canceled, which gave it a kind of credibility that most shows never earn. MacFarlane later reflected on the double cancellation and said something that cuts to the heart of why this history matters. He said that one of the positive aspects of Family Guy constantly being pulled off the air is that we were always having to restaff writers. He framed the cancellations not as disasters that damaged the show, but as disruptions that accidentally kept the creative team from going stale. Every time the show came back, new people came with it, new perspectives, new sensibilities, new ways of approaching the characters. The forced restaffing that felt like a crisis in the moment turned out to be one of the things that kept the show alive creatively in a way that a smooth, uninterrupted run might not have. The Simpsons never went through anything like this. The Simpsons has been renewed continuously since 1989. In April 2025, Fox announced a new 4-season renewal that takes the show through season 40, which would mean it is still producing new episodes in 2028 or 2029. This renewal was announced not in response to strong ratings or overwhelming fan demand, but as part of what was described as a mega deal that also included renewals for Bob's Burgers and the return of American Dad to the Fox network. The deal was a business arrangement between Disney, which owns the show, and Fox, which airs it. The language used by Fox Entertainment's president when announcing the deal was about the shows being iconic comedies and about a successful partnership between the networks. It was the language of business. It was not the language of a network that had been forced to admit it could not ignore how much its audience wanted more. There is a meaningful difference between a show that continues because a corporation has decided it is worth continuing and a show that continues because the people watching it refuse to accept that it was over. That difference is not just sentimental, it reflects something real about the relationship between a show and its audience. Family Guy's audience, at a specific and critical moment in the show's history, made a choice. They bought the DVDs, they watched the reruns, they signed the petitions, they told the network in the clearest possible terms that the show mattered to them, and the network listened. The Simpsons audience, in its current form, has not done anything like that. The show's viewership has declined from approximately 14 million people per episode during its peak years to approximately 1.2 million people per episode in its most recent seasons. That is a drop of more than 90%. The show has not been canceled, not because audiences are fighting for it, but because it costs Disney and Fox relatively little to keep producing it compared to the revenue it generates through merchandise, licensing, theme park attractions, and streaming deals. The Simpsons is not surviving because people love it. It is surviving because it is a very valuable piece of intellectual property that has been running long enough that stopping it feels stranger than continuing it. Family Guy was also renewed in April 2025 for 4 more seasons through season 27. A spin-off series focused on Stewie was given a 2-season order in March 2026. But Family Guy's renewal comes in the context of a show that was the 3rd most streamed program in the United States in 2024, with 42.44 billion viewing minutes on Hulu, and the 4th most streamed show in the first half of 2025. The show is being renewed because people are watching it actively right now in very large numbers. That is a different conversation than the one happening around The Simpsons. None of this means that getting canceled and coming back automatically makes a show better than one that never got canceled. That would be a strange argument to make. What it means is that Family Guy, at 2 separate points in its history, had to demonstrate that it deserved to exist. It had to prove to an audience that it was worth their time and their energy, and in the case of the DVD buyers, their money, and the audience agreed. Enthusiastically enough to change the mind of a major television network. That is a different kind of relationship between a show and the people watching it than anything The Simpsons has had in at least 20 years. The Simpsons inherited its audience from its greatest years and has been drawing down on that inheritance ever since. Family Guy built its audience from nothing, lost it, rebuilt it, lost it again, and then rebuilt it a second time from the ground up using syndication, reruns, and physical media sales and sheer fan determination. Those are 2 very different histories, and they go a long way toward explaining why, when you look at what each show means to the people watching it today, Family Guy has something The Simpsons has not had in a very long time. Quote _3 _. But survival and audience loyalty only tell part of the story, because numbers alone do not explain why people keep coming back to Family Guy week after week, year after year in the streaming era. To understand that, you need to look at what is actually on the screen, and specifically at the part of the show that most of its critics dismiss without ever examining closely enough. The numbers tell you that people are watching. What we need to talk about next is why. Section 5. The numbers don't lie. Family Guy in the streaming era. Numbers are not everything. Anyone who has spent time thinking about television knows that ratings and viewing figures do not automatically tell you which show is better, more meaningful, or more worth your time. Plenty of great shows have had small audiences. Plenty of terrible shows have had enormous ones. A number by itself does not prove quality. But numbers do prove something. They prove that people are choosing to spend their time with something. And when the numbers are as large as the ones surrounding Family Guy in the streaming era, when they are not just big but historically big, when they place a show that many critics have been dismissing for years at the very top of what the entire country is watching, they become harder and harder to wave away as meaningless. At some point, the gap between the critical conversation about a show and the actual behavior of the people watching it becomes a story in itself. That gap in the case of Family Guy versus The Simpsons, is enormous. Let us start with 2024 because 2024 is the most recent full year for which complete streaming data is available, and the data from that year is about as clear as data gets. Nielsen Media Research, the company that has been measuring what Americans watch for decades, published its annual report on streaming viewership. The report covered every major streaming platform in the United States: Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, Paramount Plus, Peacock, and the rest. It measured total viewing minutes for every show available on every platform. It then ranked those shows from most watched to least watched. Family Guy ranked third in the entire country, not third among animated shows, not third among adult comedies, third among every single show on every single streaming platform in the United States for the entire calendar year of 2024. It accumulated 42.44 billion viewing minutes on Hulu. To understand what that number actually means in human terms, consider this: 1 billion minutes is roughly 1,900 years. Family Guy accumulated more than 42 times that amount in a single year. People spent the equivalent of roughly 80,000 years watching Family Guy on Hulu in 2024. The two shows ahead of it were Bluey, the Australian children's cartoon that has become one of the most watched shows on any platform for any audience, and Grey's Anatomy, the medical drama that has been on ABC for over 20 years and has one of the largest back catalogs of any show currently streaming. Family Guy sat between those two programs as the third most watched thing in the country. The Simpsons did not appear in the top 10, not because the data was not measured. The Simpsons is available on Disney Plus and the data was collected. It simply did not generate enough viewing to place in the top 10 most watched shows in the United States for the year. A show that many people still reflexively refer to as the greatest animated series ever made, a show with over 800 episodes available for streaming, a show that has been on the air for 36 years and has the largest library of any animated series in American history, could not crack the top 10 in a year when Family Guy finished third. The 2025 data tells the same story. Nielsen released its mid-year streaming report covering January through June of 2025, and Family Guy ranked fourth overall behind Bluey, Grey's Anatomy, and NCIS. 6 of the top 20 most watched streaming shows in that period were animated programs, and Family Guy was the highest ranked adult animated show among them. Bob's Burgers was 5th, SpongeBob was 6th, American Dad was 12th, South Park was 20th. The Simpsons again did not appear in the top 20. There are specific weeks within this period where the Family Guy numbers become almost difficult to believe. During the week of August 26 to September 1st, 2024, Family Guy accumulated more than 1 billion minutes of viewing time in 7 days. That single week placed it as the third most streamed series in the entire country for that week. The following weeks were similar. From July 29th to August 4th, 2024, the show was watched for 910 million minutes. From August 5th to 11th, it generated 881 million minutes of viewing, making it the 6th most streamed show overall that week. From August 12th to 18th, it produced 834 million minutes, ranking 8th overall. These are not spike numbers from a single viral moment. These are consistent week after week figures that show a show with a stable and very large audience returning to it regularly throughout the year. In December 2025, Disney made an official announcement that Family Guy had surpassed 1 billion hours streamed on Disney Plus during 2025. Not minutes, hours. 1 billion of them in a single year on a single platform in the markets outside the United States where Disney Plus carries the show. The Mandalorian, one of the most expensive and heavily promoted shows Disney has ever produced, crossed the same milestone in the same announcement. Family Guy was mentioned in the same sentence as one of the flagship productions of the most powerful entertainment company in the world. In January 2026, Nielsen announced the winners of its second annual ARTI Awards, which recognized the titles and creators that generated the most audience attention across streaming platforms during the previous year. Seth MacFarlane received the inaugural Streaming Icon of the Year award. The award was created specifically to recognize a creator whose collective body of work on streaming generated more viewing than any other single creator. MacFarlane's shows, primarily Family Guy and American Dad, produced over 60 billion viewing minutes across all platforms in 2025. 60 billion. Family Guy alone ranked as the 7th most watched streaming title of the entire year of 2025. American Dad ranked as the 3rd most watched adult animated streaming title. These numbers exist alongside the fact that Family Guy is not just streaming. The show airs new episodes on Fox. It airs repeats on Adult Swim, which re-added the show to its lineup starting January 1st, 2025, after a period away. It airs on Comedy Central, which added the show in September 2024. It airs on FX and FXX. In early 2025, when Family Guy Season 23 was actively airing new episodes on Fox, the show had newer repeat episodes running across 4 different cable and broadcast channels simultaneously, plus Hulu streaming the full library. That level of distribution does not happen to shows that are fading. It happens to shows that platforms and networks are actively competing to carry because the audience for them is large and reliable. Now put The Simpsons next to all of this. The Simpsons currently averages approximately 1.2 million viewers per episode on Fox. That number comes from the show's most recent seasons and represents a decline of more than 90% from the show's peak viewership of around 14.4 million per episode in its best years. A drop of that size, sustained over that many seasons, represents one of the most dramatic long-term audience collapses in the history of American television. The show is technically still watched by over 1 million people each week, which is not nothing. But in the context of what the show once was and in the context of what Family Guy is doing right now, it tells a very different story about where each show stands. The streaming numbers for The Simpsons are not publicly broken out in the same detailed way as Family Guy's, which is itself informative. When a show is generating the kind of viewing minutes that Family Guy produces, the companies that own it have every reason to publicize those numbers. When a show is not, those numbers tend not to appear in press releases or award announcements. There is also the matter of how each show performs as a piece of content designed to be rewatched. Family Guy, according to Nielsen's data on Hulu viewing behavior, has one of the highest rates of repeat viewing of any show on the platform. American Dad, which is made by the same creator and has a similar format, was identified in Nielsen's 2024 data as the 2nd most binged show on Hulu, with an average of 175.3 episodes streamed per user. That is a viewer watching an average of 175 episodes in a single stretch. The format of these shows, relatively short, self-contained episodes built around rapid-fire jokes, turns out to be almost perfectly designed for the way people watch streaming content in 2025. You can put it on at any point, watch 1 episode or 20, and the experience works either way. The Simpsons format, by contrast, has become increasingly hard to engage with for new viewers. The show's sheer size, over 800 episodes spread across 36 seasons with wildly inconsistent quality, makes it difficult to navigate. The Golden Era episodes that everyone genuinely loves are buried inside a library that also contains hundreds of episodes that most longtime fans would admit are not worth watching. New viewers who approach the show without knowing which seasons to prioritize often bounce off the later material and never make their way back to the earlier greatness. Family Guy's relative youth and the relative consistency of its quality across its run makes it a much easier show to pick up and get into. The April 2025 renewal announcement made the commercial reality of both shows visible in a single moment. Fox renewed both The Simpsons and Family Guy for 4 more seasons each. But the language around the 2 renewals and the context surrounding them pointed in different directions. The Simpsons renewal was presented as a continuation of an institution. Family Guy's renewal was presented in the context of its streaming dominance and its active audience. Fox Entertainment's president specifically mentioned Seth MacFarlane twice in the announcement, calling the deal a double celebration of the enduring relationship with MacFarlane specifically. Family Guy was renewed because the numbers demanded it. The Simpsons was renewed because stopping it would be a bigger story than continuing it. All of this adds up to a picture that is hard to argue with if you are willing to look at it clearly. Family Guy is not a show that peaked in 1997 and has been coasting on goodwill ever since. It is a show that is actively right now in 2025 and 2026 one of the most watched programs in the United States by a significant margin. It is a show whose creator just received a streaming award for generating 60 billion viewing minutes in a single year. It is a show that is being carried by 4 different television networks simultaneously because those networks want the audience that comes with it. The Simpsons is a show that averages 1.2 million viewers per new episode on the network that gave it its first home, that did not crack the top 10 in streaming for the full year of 2024, and that is being kept alive primarily because it is a franchise asset worth more as a brand than it is as a television program. Numbers are not everything, but they are not nothing either. And when the numbers are this consistent, this large, and this clearly pointed in one direction, they stop being just numbers and start being an answer. Underscore underscore, quote underscore for underscore underscore. The streaming data tells you that people are watching Family Guy. What it does not fully explain is what they are watching it for. And the most common assumption about why people watch Family Guy, that it is just a string of random jokes with nothing underneath, turns out to be wrong in a way that is more interesting than the assumption itself. Because buried inside a show that built its reputation on absurd cutaway gags and shock humor is an emotional relationship between 2 characters that is more carefully constructed and more genuinely moving than anything The Simpsons has produced in at least 20 years. Section 6, Stewie and Brian. Family Guy's secret emotional core. The most common criticism of Family Guy goes something like this. The show does not care about its characters. It does not care about story. It does not care about anything except the next joke, and the joke after that, and the one after that. And when the jokes run out, it just throws something shocking at the screen and calls it comedy. The characters are hollow. The relationships are fake. Nothing that happens in one episode matters in the next one. There is no heart anywhere in the building. This criticism gets repeated so often by so many people that it has started to feel like a fact rather than an opinion. Critics say it, Simpsons fans say it, people who have watched maybe 4 episodes of Family Guy and formed a complete picture of the show from those 4 episodes say it. And the strange thing is that the evidence against this criticism has been sitting in plain sight for over 20 years in almost every episode of the show, in the relationship between a talking dog named Brian Griffin and a baby named Stewie Griffin. That relationship is the emotional spine of Family Guy. It is the part of the show that critics who dismiss the whole thing as heartless never seem to account for. And when you look at it carefully, when you trace it from its beginning all the way through to where it stands today, it turns out to be one of the most consistently developed emotional relationships in the history of adult animated television. Brian Griffin was introduced in the very first episode of the show as the family dog. He talks, he drinks martinis, he has opinions about literature and politics and film, and he acts as a kind of grounding voice against Peter Griffin's constant chaos. In the earliest episodes, the central comedic pairing was Peter and Brian. Peter would do something catastrophically stupid and Brian would react to it with weary disbelief. That dynamic was funny and it worked, but it was not particularly deep. Brian was a straight man, Peter was the clown. The relationship existed to set up and deliver jokes. Stewie Griffin was introduced in the same first episode as a diabolical baby with a British accent, an obsession with world domination, and a plan to kill his mother Lois. The jokes around Stewie in the earliest seasons came almost entirely from the contrast between what he was, a baby in a diaper who was supposed to be helpless, and what he actually was, which was a small evil genius building weapons in his bedroom and delivering villain speeches to anyone who would listen. For the first season and a half, Brian and Stewie barely interacted. They existed in the same show but in separate lanes. Brian was Peter's friend, Stewie was the baby doing his own thing in the background. The pairing that would eventually define the show had not yet been discovered. Then came a season 2 episode called Road to Rhode Island, which aired on May 30th, 2000. The setup was simple. Brian had to go pick up Stewie from his grandparents' house. They lost their plane tickets. They had to find another way home. What followed was the first real extended interaction between the two characters, a road trip full of unexpected moments, a musical number, and a sequence in which Brian tracked down the puppy mill where he was born and found what remained of his mother. That last part was not played for laughs, it was played straight. Brian confronted something painful from his own past, and Stewie was there beside him when it happened, not making it worse and not turning it into a punchline. The episode scored 8.1 out of 10 on IMDb. It was nominated for an Emmy Award, though it lost to The Simpsons that year, but more importantly, it established something that the show would spend the next 20-plus seasons building on. Brian and Stewie worked together in a way that nobody had anticipated. The dry, depressed aspiring writer Dog and the diabolical infant genius had a chemistry that was different from anything else in the show. They were too different to naturally be friends, which paradoxically made their friendship feel more real than most. The road to episodes, as they came to be known, became one of the defining features of the show. Seth MacFarlane modeled them on a series of comedy films from the 1940s and 1950s, starring Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, called Road to Morocco, Road to Rio, and others. Those films were known for their loose, rambling format, their musical numbers, their jokes, and the easy chemistry between their two leads. MacFarlane took that template and applied it to Brian and Stewie, sending them on increasingly elaborate adventures while maintaining the emotional core that Road to Rhode Island had established. The series grew to 8 installments: Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, Road to Europe in Season 3, Road to Rupert in Season 5, Road to Germany in Season 7, Road to the Multiverse in Season 8, Road to the North Pole in Season 9, Road to Vegas in Season 11, Road to India in Season 14. Each episode built on the relationship that came before it, adding layers to how the two characters understood each other and what they meant to each other. Road to the Multiverse, the 5th installment, and the Season 8 premiere, is widely considered the high point of the series. Stewie shows Brian a remote control that allows them to travel between parallel universes. They visit a universe where religion never existed and humanity is far more scientifically advanced. They visit a Disney-style universe rendered in the visual style of old Disney cartoons. They visit a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are kept as pets, which puts Brian in the position of being at the top of the social order for the first and only time. The episode is funny, inventive, and formally ambitious in a way that demonstrates what the show can do when it is operating at its best. It scored 9.1 on IMDb, making it one of the highest rated episodes in the show's history. But the most important Brian and Stewie episode is not one of the Road to installments. It is a Season 8 episode called Brian and Stewie, which aired on May 2nd, 2010, and which stands apart from everything else in the show's catalog as a genuinely unusual piece of television. The episode has a simple premise. Brian and Stewie get accidentally locked inside a bank vault over a weekend. They cannot get out. They have to spend the entire time together with no one else around. And the episode, for its entire running time of roughly 28 minutes, stays inside that vault. There are no cutaway gags, not a single one. There's no music. There are no other characters. There is no B-plot happening elsewhere in the Griffin household. Just Brian and Stewie, stuck in a small room, forced to confront each other and themselves. This was the only episode in the show's history to abandon the cutaway format entirely. The episode was written by Gary Janetti and directed by Dominic Bianchi. It aired to 7.68 million viewers. The Parents Television Council, which had been criticizing Family Guy for years, immediately complained about a sequence in which Brian is forced to eat Stewie's dirty diaper contents to prevent Stewie from getting a rash. That sequence is genuinely gross. It is also in context one of the more extreme demonstrations of how much Brian actually cares about Stewie. He does something deeply unpleasant, not because he was forced to at gunpoint, but because Stewie needed him to. The episode contains a scene near its end that multiple critics and viewers have described as the most emotionally direct moment in the show's entire run. Stewie, having spent most of the episode pushing Brian toward the edge of his patience, eventually tells Brian that he gives his life purpose, and that maybe that is enough, because that is about the greatest gift one friend can give another. Brian tells Stewie that he loves him. It is played completely straight, no joke follows it, the episode ends. Reading the IMDb reviews for Brian and Stewie reveals something interesting. Many of the positive reviews come from people who describe being surprised. They expected a normal Family Guy episode and got something that felt closer to a character study. One reviewer wrote that it was the first time Family Guy had really challenged viewers and that it was possible to close read the episode, finding meaning inside it the way you would look for meaning inside a serious film or a piece of literature. Another wrote that the end of the episode was probably the last time the show had shown genuine emotion since a season 3 episode called Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows. The specific detail in that observation matters. This viewer had been watching the show carefully enough to track its emotional moments across 8 seasons and identify the gaps between them. That is not the behavior of an audience watching a show they consider completely empty. When Brian was killed in season 12, the fan reaction was significant enough to warrant national news coverage. People were genuinely upset. The show replaced him temporarily with a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico from The Sopranos, and the audience's rejection of the replacement was immediate and sustained. Stewie's response to losing Brian was written as genuine grief. He blamed himself for not being able to bring his best friend back, and he was the last member of the family to accept Vinny, and even when he did accept Vinny, he never stopped mourning Brian. The show reversed the death and brought Brian back within a few episodes. The whole arc lasted less than 2 months in real time, but the intensity of the audience reaction demonstrated something clearly. People had developed real emotional investment in Brian Griffin, and specifically in Brian's relationship with Stewie, in a way that went beyond simply finding them funny. Now compare this to The Simpsons and its handling of its own central relationships. Homer and Marge have been married for 36 seasons. In the early years of the show, their relationship had genuine weight. There were episodes, particularly in seasons 3 through 8, where the marriage felt real and complicated in ways that were both funny and emotionally honest. The season 4 episode, A Streetcar Named Marge, in which Marge joins a local theater production of A Streetcar Named Desire, and Homer fails to appreciate her talent until the very end, is a real exploration of two people who love each other but sometimes fail to see each other clearly. That kind of episode was possible when the show still cared about who these characters were. In later seasons, Homer and Marge's relationship became a formula. Homer does something wrong, Marge is disappointed, Homer realizes his mistake and apologizes, everything resets. The emotional specificity that made the early stories feel real was replaced by a structure. You could predict where any Homer and Marge episode was going within the first 3 minutes because the show had run the same arc so many times that it had worn a groove into the floor that it could not climb out of. Brian and Stewie's relationship does not work that way. It grows and changes and surprises. The show's willingness to produce an episode like Brian and Stewie, which abandoned every single one of the show's usual structural elements to spend 28 minutes inside a bank vault with two characters talking to each other, is proof that the people making Family Guy still believe those characters have something to say that is worth listening to. The conventional picture of Family Guy as a show with no emotional depth is not accurate. The emotional depth is there. It has always been there. It lives specifically in the relationship between a talking dog who is deeply unhappy with his own life and a baby genius who, beneath all the evil plans and the British accent and the casual cruelty, needs someone to tell him that he matters. That is a real story, and the show tells it well. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What is harder to defend about Family Guy is its structure. The cutaway gag format that defines the show has been criticized more than any other single element of it, by more people more consistently over a longer period of time than almost any other aspect of any other animated show, and the criticism is not entirely wrong. But the defense of that structure is more interesting than the attack on it, and it requires understanding something about what the cutaway gag is actually doing that most people who criticize it have never stopped to consider. Section 7, the cutaway defense, Family Guy's structure is smarter than it looks. Every conversation about Family Guy eventually arrives at the same place. Someone brings up the cutaway gags, someone else agrees that the cutaway gags are lazy, someone mentions that real comedy requires setup and payoff within a story, that jokes should grow out of character and situation, that randomly cutting away from the main plot to show something unrelated for 20 seconds is a sign that the writers ran out of ideas and needed to fill time. The conversation ends with everyone nodding and moving on, satisfied that the cutaway format has been identified and dismissed. What almost never happens in that conversation is anyone stopping to ask what the cutaway gag is actually doing. Not whether it is lazy, not whether it is funny, but what it is doing as a piece of construction. What function does it serve inside the episode? Why did Seth MacFarlane build his show around this format instead of the more traditional story-driven format that The Simpsons and most other animated comedies use, and whether the answer to those questions might be more interesting than the dismissal suggests? Start with where the format came from, because MacFarlane has talked about this in specific terms. He drew from a series of comedy films made in the 1940s and 1950s starring Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. Those films had titles like Road to Morocco, Road to Rio, Road to Utopia, and Road to Bali. They were not tightly plotted films, they were loose, rambling, joke-forward adventures in which the two stars would travel to some exotic location and get into escalating trouble, pausing regularly to deliver jokes directly to the camera, comment on the film they were in, and perform musical numbers that had nothing to do with the story. The plot existed as a clothesline to hang jokes on. The jokes were the point. Nobody watched Road to Morocco because they cared deeply about the narrative logic of how Crosby and Hope ended up in North Africa. They watched it because Crosby and Hope were funny together, and the film gave them a lot of room to be funny. MacFarlane took that philosophy and applied it to a 30-minute television format. The Griffin family's situation in any given episode is the clothesline. The cutaway gags are the jokes hung on it. The story exists not to be taken seriously as a story, but to provide a recurring anchor point that the jokes can depart from and return to. This is a legitimate comedic approach with a long history. It is different from what The Simpsons does, but different is not the same as worse. The specific mechanics of how a cutaway gag works are worth understanding. A character in the scene makes a statement, usually a comparison or a memory or a claim about something. Peter might say something like, "That was the most embarrassing moment of my life, worse than the time I tried to teach a cooking class." The show then cuts away from the living room and shows a brief scene of Peter attempting to teach a cooking class and something going catastrophically wrong. The cutaway ends. The show returns to the living room. The original conversation continues. On the surface, this looks like a random joke inserted for no reason, but something real is happening beneath the surface. The joke is doing character work. It is adding a piece of information about Peter Griffin, specifically that he once tried to teach a cooking class and it went badly, that the audience now carries with them. It is also making a connection between the situation Peter is currently in and a situation he has been in before. The cutaway is not interrupting the story. It is commenting on it. It is associating the current moment with another moment through the logic of how Peter's mind works, which is a very specific and internally consistent logic even when the results are completely absurd. MacFarlane himself articulated his creative philosophy around this in a way that is worth understanding directly. He said that the show's goal was to make jokes, that job one in a sitcom is to keep people laughing, and that he felt the goal sometimes got lost in shows that focused too heavily on story and character development. He was not dismissing story and character development as unimportant. He was saying that in a sitcom specifically, the primary obligation is to the audience's enjoyment in the moment, and that everything else exists in service of that obligation. This is a defensible creative position. It is also an honest one. Family Guy does not pretend to be something it is not. It does not claim to be a deeply plotted drama with rich character arcs. It is a comedy show that is primarily interested in making you laugh. The cutaway gag is the most efficient tool it has found for doing that, and it uses that tool constantly and without apology. Now here is where the format turns out to be smarter than it first appears. The rise of social media, short-form video, and the way people consume comedy online in 2025 has revealed something interesting about the cutaway gag format that nobody could have predicted when the show began in 1999. Individual cutaway clips, each running between 15 and 45 seconds, are almost perfectly sized for TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, and the other platforms where short video content lives. A Family Guy cutaway gag can be pulled out of its episode context, uploaded as a standalone clip, and watched and understood by someone who has never seen a single full episode of the show. The joke is self-contained. It does not require knowing who Peter is or what was happening in the scene before the cutaway. It just works. This has made Family Guy one of the most shared comedy shows on social media by a significant margin. Clips of the show circulate constantly across every platform where video is consumed. Each clip brings in viewers who then go looking for more. Some of those viewers find their way to the full show on Hulu. The format that critics have spent 20 plus years calling lazy has turned out to be accidentally perfect for the media landscape that exists in 2025. The Simpsons does not benefit from this dynamic in the same way. The golden era Simpsons episodes that people still love are built around longer story structures, layered jokes, and character moments that gain their full power from context. A clip of Homer saying a funny line in the middle of a classic episode is funny, but it is often funnier if you know what led to that line and what comes after it. The jokes are embedded in the fabric of their episodes rather than designed as standalone units. This was a strength during the era when people watched television episodes from beginning to end. It is a limitation in an era when most comedy reaches new audiences through 30-second clips on a phone screen. The show that critics have been calling lazy for 20 years turns out to have a format that is more suited to how people consume comedy in 2025 than the format of the show those same critics have been calling more sophisticated. There is also a formal ambition in Family Guy's willingness to experiment with and depart from its own established format when the story calls for it. The show's most creatively daring episodes are the ones that abandon the cutaway structure entirely or dramatically modify it to do something different. Brian and Stewie, which was covered in the previous section, has no cutaway gags at all. It is a bottle episode. It's a single location, two characters, no departures from the main scene. The Road to episodes use a different visual style and a different musical format than regular episodes. The episode and then there were fewer. The season 9 episode that Seth MacFarlane has identified as his personal favorite of the entire series. It is structured as an Agatha Christie-style murder mystery in which a group of characters are trapped in a house and someone begins killing them off one by one. It is 45 minutes long instead of the usual 22. It has a genuine plot twist. It is played almost entirely straight. A show with no creative ambition does not produce episodes like that. A show that is purely running on autopilot does not periodically stop and try something completely different from its usual format, risk the discomfort of its regular audience, and pull it off. These experiments are proof that the people making Family Guy are still thinking about what the show can do, still testing its boundaries, still interested in the question of what a Family Guy episode is allowed to be. The Simpsons, by comparison, has become almost completely rigid in its format. The show's structure across its recent seasons is predictable to the point of being mechanical. The cold open is usually unrelated to the main plot. The first act establishes a situation. The second act develops it. The third act resolves it with Homer or another family member learning something small. The credits roll. The formula is followed so consistently that watching a new episode of The Simpsons in its current form feels less like watching something someone made and more like watching a very expensive and technically proficient process completing itself. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which air every year around Halloween and have been a tradition since season 2, were once one of the most creative things on television. They were given a specific set of rules, 3 short horror-themed segments, not bound by the show's usual continuity, free to be darker and stranger than regular episodes. In the early seasons, the writers used this freedom to make episodes that were genuinely disturbing and inventive. The Shining, a parody of The Shining from Treehouse of Horror 5, is still considered one of the funniest things the show ever produced. The segment Time and Punishment from the same episode, in which Homer travels back in time by sneezing inside a toaster and keeps accidentally changing history, is a piece of tight, well-constructed absurdist comedy that holds up completely. Recent Treehouse of Horror episodes have been widely described by fans and critics as going through the motions. The format is still there, the 3-segment structure is still there, but the freedom that the format was supposed to unlock, the freedom to be weird and dark and inventive, has been replaced by a familiarity that makes the episodes feel comfortable instead of unsettling, routine instead of surprising. Family Guy's equivalent of the Treehouse of Horror, its special episodes and its road to installments, has not calcified in the same way. Road to the Multiverse in Season 8 went to genuinely unusual visual and conceptual places. Road to the North Pole in Season 9 was notably dark for a Christmas episode, following Brian and Stewie as they discover that the commercial reality of Christmas has pushed Santa Claus to the point of breakdown, and the elves are overworked and miserable. The episode used the holiday special format to make an uncomfortable point about consumer culture while still being funny. That combination, uncomfortable point, still funny, is exactly what the best Family Guy episodes do and what the best early Simpsons episodes did, and it is something the current Simpsons almost never attempts. None of this is to say that every Family Guy cutaway gag is brilliant. Many of them are not. Some of them are filler. Some of them go on too long. Some of them are the kind of shock for shock's sake joke that critics point to when they make the case that the show is irresponsible or cruel. Those criticisms are not without basis, but the format itself, when understood on its own terms, is not lazy. It is a specific creative approach with a specific philosophy behind it, adapted from a comedy tradition that goes back decades, and it has proven to be more commercially durable and more suited to the current media landscape than almost anyone predicted when the show first aired. ___quote_6___. The question of whether Family Guy goes too far, whether the jokes cross lines they should not cross, whether the shock humor is ever actually harmful rather than just uncomfortable, is a real question worth taking seriously. It is also a question that applies to The Simpsons too, just in a different way and at a different scale. Because the thing The Simpsons has done over 36 seasons that might be more damaging than anything Family Guy has ever put in a cutaway gag is something quieter and harder to see. It happened to a specific character slowly over many years, and it fundamentally changed what the show was willing to say about the people it was supposed to be celebrating. Section 8, Homer's Downward Spiral, the central failure of modern Simpsons. If you want to understand what went wrong with The Simpsons, you do not need to look at the ratings charts. You do not need to read the critical essays or count the departing writers or analyze the showrunner changes. You just need to watch 2 episodes back to back. Watch a season 1 episode called There's No Disgrace Like Home. Then watch any random episode from season 20 or later. Watch the man at the center of both episodes. Watch what he does and why he does it, and how he treats the people around him. And then ask yourself whether those 2 men are the same person. They are not. Not even close, and the distance between them is the single most important fact about The Simpsons' decline that never gets discussed clearly enough. Homer Simpson is the most central character in The Simpsons. He is not just the main character in the way that Peter Griffin is the main character of Family Guy, where the show has multiple characters operating at roughly equal importance, and Peter is simply the one whose name is closest to the title. Homer is the engine. The show's entire emotional architecture in its best years was built around Homer. His love for his family was the thing that grounded every story, no matter how absurd the situation got. His fundamental decency buried under layers of laziness and stupidity and bad decisions was the thing that made you root for him. He was, at his best, one of the most human characters in the history of animated television. A real person, more or less, rendered in yellow and given a funny voice. What happened to that person over 36 seasons is not a mystery, and it is not subtle. It is one of the most thoroughly documented character declines in television history, discussed by critics, by fans, by the people who study how storytelling works, and even by the show itself. In Season 1's There's No Disgrace Like Home, Homer takes his family to his boss Mr. Burns' company picnic. He is desperately hoping they will behave well enough that he will not be embarrassed in front of his employer. They do not behave well. Marge gets drunk, Bart and Lisa fight. Homer is mortified. He spends the rest of the episode obsessed with the idea that his family is broken and needs to be fixed. He sees a commercial for a family therapist and becomes convinced that therapy is the answer. To pay for the sessions, he pawns the family television set. The man who in later seasons would be defined almost entirely by his obsessive love of television voluntarily sold the television because he cared more about being a good father than about watching it. That is not a small detail, that is a foundational character moment. It tells you exactly who Homer Simpson was designed to be. A man who makes bad decisions constantly, but who, underneath all of it, is oriented toward his family. A man who embarrasses himself and his kids and his wife on a regular basis, but who is embarrassed by this, who is wounded by it, who wants to do better. A man who sells the TV. In Season 1's Homer's Odyssey, Homer loses his job at the nuclear plant after an accident. His response to this is not to shrug and go find something fun to do. His response is to spiral into severe depression because he has failed as a provider. He reaches a point where he considers ending his own life. His family's love pulls him back. He then becomes Springfield's safety inspector because he has been through the nuclear plant and he genuinely knows it is not being run safely, and he wants to protect people from it. That Homer Simpson, the one who gets suicidally depressed about losing his job because it means failing his family, the one who turns his personal crisis into a genuine effort to protect his community, is completely unrecognizable in any episode produced after approximately Season 12. The show tracked this transformation itself, which makes it even harder to excuse as something nobody noticed. In the Season 7 episode called The Simpsons 138th Episode Spectacular, a clip show hosted by the character Troy McClure, the show read out a letter from a viewer. The letter was attributed to a Professor Lawrence Pierce of the University of Chicago. It said, "I think Homer gets stupider every year." Troy McClure's response was, "That is not a question, Professor, but we will let the viewers judge for themselves." A montage of Homer being progressively more stupid across multiple seasons than played. The show was making a self-aware joke about its own main character's decline in Season 7, which means the decline had already been noticed and documented and turned into a bit by the show's own writers before the show had even reached what most fans would call the beginning of its serious problems. Think about what that means. By Season 7, the show already knew Homer was getting stupider. The writers knew it clearly enough to make an extended joke about it in a clip show episode, and then the show kept going for almost 30 more seasons, continuing the exact process it had already identified and already made fun of. TV Tropes, the website that documents storytelling patterns and character developments across all of film and television, has one of the most detailed analyses of Homer's decline anywhere online. Their documentation describes Homer's trajectory in specific terms. Season 1, Homer is described as a strict parent figure embarrassed by his family. By season 9 and season 10, he had begun to become what they call a jerk, someone who behaved badly not out of carelessness but out of something closer to deliberate selfishness. By season 11, he had lost whatever remained of his impulse control and had become, in their words, a dangerously imbecilic, aggressive alcoholic with no emotional control, bursting into tears and throwing a temper tantrum on a regular basis. They note that the show even lampshaded this in what they call the 138th episode spectacular. Their term lampshaded meaning the show acknowledged its own problem while continuing to have the problem. The Screen Rant analysis of Homer's character changes puts it simply. They write that Homer has devolved as if at some point he had a crayon shoved into his brain. That references to an actual Simpsons episode called Homer the Moe. Wait, actually the relevant episode is called Home-R from season 12, in which it is revealed that as a child, Homer shoved a crayon up his nose and it lodged in his brain, reducing his intelligence. He has the crayon removed, temporarily becomes highly intelligent, then chooses to have it reinserted because being smart makes him miserable. It is a clever episode in some ways. It is also, in retrospect, the show canonically explaining why Homer has been getting stupider for over a decade. The writers had noticed the problem, made it the subject of an episode, given it a fictional explanation, and then used that fictional explanation to justify continuing it. The love for his family that defined the season 1, Homer disappeared so gradually that most viewers who grew up watching the show in the 1990s did not notice it going. They noticed that Homer was funnier in some ways in the middle seasons, that his stupidity was generating bigger laughs, that the show felt looser and more unpredictable. What they did not notice or did not think to name was that Homer had stopped being a person who deeply loved his family and had become a person who occasionally mentioned his family between scenes of doing other things. The engine had been removed, the shell remained. Now put Peter Griffin next to this. Peter Griffin has also been criticized for becoming more stupid over the course of Family Guy's run. That criticism has some validity, but there is a fundamental difference between what happened to Peter and what happened to Homer that most people who make this comparison do not acknowledge. Peter Griffin was established from the very beginning of Family Guy as a man who had been officially registered as clinically below average intelligence. That fact was part of his character from the show's earliest seasons. His stupidity was not a gradual drift from a smarter starting point, it was a defined characteristic from day one. When Peter does something catastrophically stupid in season 20 of Family Guy, he is doing something consistent with who he has always been. When Homer did something catastrophically stupid in season 20 of The Simpsons, he was doing something that required you to forget completely who he was in season 1. There is also the question of Peter's relationship with his family. Peter Griffin, despite everything, has continued to demonstrate genuine love for Lois and his children throughout the show's run in ways that the show acknowledges and builds stories around. The relationship between Peter and Lois is not the emotional center of Family Guy the way Homer and Marge were the emotional center of The Simpsons, but it is a real relationship with real moments of warmth in it that the show returns to regularly. Peter and Lois have had their marriage seriously tested in episodes that were written with genuine care. The moments where Peter's love for his family breaks through his selfishness and stupidity are still written to land emotionally because the show still treats them as emotionally meaningful. The current Simpsons largely does not do this with Homer anymore. His relationship with Marge has become formulaic in the way described in earlier sections of this essay. His relationship with his children has become almost incidental. Bart and Homer interact in ways that feel like the show is fulfilling an obligation rather than exploring a relationship it is still interested in. Lisa and Homer have had genuine moments in recent seasons, which is one of the few areas where the current show can still occasionally access something real, but even those moments are surrounded by so much formula that they feel like small fires burning inside a cold building. The strangest thing about Homer's decline is that it was not necessary. It was not forced on the show by some external pressure. The writers chose over and over, season after season, to make Homer stupider and crueler and less connected to the things that had made him worth caring about. They chose this because stupidity is easier to write than complexity. A stupid Homer can be put in any situation and his reaction can be predicted, and the joke can be written without anyone having to think too hard about whether this is the kind of person Homer actually is. A complex Homer, a Homer who sometimes does the right thing and sometimes fails and feels bad about failing, requires the writers to know who he is deeply enough to make those failures feel real. That Homer requires effort. By the time the original writing staff had departed and the show was in the hands of people who had not been there when Homer was first being defined, that deeper knowledge of who Homer was had largely left the building with the writers who had it. What remained was the surface. The donut jokes, the couch gag, the dough, the strangling Bart, the iconography without the person. Peter Griffin does not have the same iconography problem because Family Guy never had quite the same iconic status to begin with, which paradoxically protected it. Nobody expected Peter Griffin to be Homer Simpson. Nobody came to Family Guy carrying 20 years of love for a version of the character that no longer existed. The show could be what it was without the weight of what it used to be pressing down on every episode. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer's decline is the most visible symptom of The Simpsons' larger problem, but it is not the only one. The show has also developed a very specific habit across its later seasons of using famous guest stars not as tools for telling stories, but as the stories themselves. A celebrity appears. The episode is shaped around making the celebrity look good. The regular characters become supporting players in what is essentially a promotional appearance dressed up as a sitcom episode. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the show's decline, and it deserves its own honest examination. Section 9. The guest star problem. When The Simpsons became a vanity platform, there is a version of a celebrity guest appearance in a television show that works beautifully. The celebrity plays a character or plays a version of themselves that serves the story the episode is trying to tell. Their presence creates a specific kind of tension or comedy or emotional weight that the regular cast cannot produce on their own. The episode would be noticeably worse without them. When they leave, the story continues forward rather than simply ending because the guest has finished their segment. This version of the celebrity guest appearance exists in television, and The Simpsons produced some of the best examples of it during its golden years. Then there is the other version. The celebrity arrives. The episode reorganizes itself around them. The regular characters step back and become supporting players in what is essentially a promotional visit. The story exists not to tell something true about the world or the characters, but to give the famous person a platform and make them look appealing to the audience. The episode ends and nothing has changed, nothing has been said, nothing has been added to the ongoing story of the show. The celebrity was there, now they are gone. That is the whole episode. The Simpsons in its later years became very good at the second version and almost completely lost the ability to do the first one. And the distance between those two things is one of the clearest ways to see the show's decline made visible in a format that is easy to understand. Start with what the show did with celebrity guests when it was still operating at the top of its ability. The season 3 episode called Stark Raving Dad aired in September 1991. It featured a large white man in a mental institution who claimed to be Michael Jackson. The character was voiced by Michael Jackson himself, credited on screen under the fake name John J. Smith because Jackson did not want the appearance to be publicly announced before the episode aired. The episode used Jackson's presence in a specific and carefully constructed way. The character was not simply Michael Jackson doing Michael Jackson things for 20 minutes while Homer watched admiringly. The character helped Bart write a birthday song for Lisa. The episode was about the relationship between Bart and Lisa, and the guest appearance existed to serve that story rather than replace it. Jackson was the vehicle for something the episode was already trying to say about siblings and love and small gestures that matter. The same season 3 episode featured athletes including Sting, Aerosmith Magic Johnson, Roger Clemens, Wade Boggs, Ken Griffey Jr., Steve Sachs, Ozzie Smith, Jose Canseco, Don Mattingly, Daryl Strawberry, and Mike Scioscia, all appearing in an episode called Homer at the Bat, where Mr. Burns recruits professional baseball players for the nuclear plant's softball team. The celebrities were funny and the episode was funny, but the story was about Mr. Burns' obsessive need to win and the way ordinary people get swept aside by powerful people who do not really care about them. The famous athletes were props for that story. They served it rather than replacing it. This is how the show used famous people during the years when it was doing the best work of its existence. The celebrity was a tool in service of a larger point. The episode had something to say that was bigger than "Look Who We Got." As the writing staff changed and the show's creative ambition faded, the approach to celebrity guests changed with it. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance shifted. Episodes began to be built around the celebrity rather than using the celebrity to build an episode. The story would be constructed to showcase the guest rather than the other way around. The regular characters would move to the edges of their own show to make room for the visitor. By seasons 14 through 19, this had become a defining feature of the show's approach. Multiple IMDb reviewers from that period described the show as, in their words, shamelessly using celebrities constantly in ways that felt forced and unnatural. The jokes around the celebrity appearances felt like they were written to flatter the guest rather than actually be funny. The stories felt like they had been designed backwards, starting with who the guest was and then constructing an episode-shaped container to hold them rather than starting with a story worth telling and then finding a guest who could serve it. The episode that most critics and fans point to as the single clearest example of this problem, and the episode most widely described as the worst in the show's entire history, is called Lisa Goes Gaga. It aired in season 23 in 2012, and it featured Lady Gaga as a guest star. Lady Gaga played herself, traveling through Springfield on a train and encountering Lisa, who is going through a period of low self-esteem because she has been voted the least popular student in school. Gaga essentially spends the episode teaching Lisa to love herself and believe in her own uniqueness, which sounds like it could be a decent story in the right hands. The problem, as identified consistently by critics and viewers, is that the episode was not really about Lisa at all. It was about Lady Gaga. The episode's emotional arc belonged to the guest star. Lisa was the supporting character in her own episode. Every scene was structured to showcase Gaga, her music, her costumes, her message, and her public persona. The Simpsons, a show that had once used celebrity appearances to illuminate something true about its own characters, had produced an episode where one of its main characters was essentially a prop in a promotional video for a famous musician. The response was severe. The episode holds one of the lowest IMDb ratings of any Simpsons episode in the show's history. Critics were not gentle about it. It was cited almost immediately as a textbook example of everything that had gone wrong with the show's relationship to celebrity culture. A show that had once made one of the most carefully constructed Michael Jackson appearances in television history had produced something that felt less like a television episode and more like a very expensive advertisement. And then, in 2019, something happened that made the Stark Raving Dad situation significantly more complicated. The HBO documentary Leaving Neverland made serious allegations about Michael Jackson's behavior toward children. After watching the documentary, the show's producers and writers made a decision that had never been made in the show's 30-year history up to that point. They removed Stark Raving Dad from circulation. The episode was pulled from streaming platforms and from syndication. It became the first and so far only episode of The Simpsons to be deliberately removed from availability by the people who made it. This decision was complicated and has been discussed extensively. But for the purposes of understanding the show's relationship to its own guest star history, the fact that the single most carefully constructed celebrity appearance in the show's golden era is now the one that has been taken away is a genuinely painful irony. The episode that showed the show at its best when using a celebrity guest can no longer be watched. The episodes that showed the show at its worst when using celebrity guests remain fully available. Family Guy has also used celebrities throughout its run. Seth MacFarlane's connections in the entertainment industry have brought in a wide range of famous voices and personalities. But the show's approach to celebrity appearances has generally been different in a specific and important way. In Family Guy, celebrities tend to appear as voices in the background of the show's world, rather than as the organizing principle of entire episodes. A famous person might voice a new character for one episode. They might appear briefly in a cutaway gag. Their presence adds something to the texture of the show without restructuring the show around them. The episodes that Family Guy fans consistently rate as the best in the show's history: Road to Rhode Island, Brian and Stewie, Road to the Multiverse, and Then There Were Fewer, share one notable characteristic: none of them feature celebrity guest stars in prominent roles. The show's best work comes from its own characters, in its own world, telling stories that grow out of who those characters are. When Family Guy does use a celebrity, it tends to be in service of the story rather than as a replacement for one. And Then There Were Fewer, which Seth MacFarlane has identified as his personal favorite episode of the entire series, is a 45-minute murder mystery in which a group of Quahog residents are invited to a dinner party and someone begins killing them off. The episode is structured as a genuine mystery with a real twist that the audience is not expected to see coming. It is played largely straight, which for a Family Guy episode is a significant creative risk. The regular cast drives the entire story. There is no famous guest around whom the episode has been built. The story earns its length and its ambition through the quality of its construction. There is also something worth noting about what the Simpsons celebrity problem reveals about the show's confidence in its own characters. When a show has to bring in a famous face to generate interest in an episode, it is implicitly acknowledging that the people already in the show are not interesting enough on their own to carry the story. In its golden years, The Simpsons did not need celebrities to make episodes worth watching. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and the world of Springfield were interesting enough, funny enough, and real enough to fill an episode without external help. Celebrities were additions to something already strong rather than substitutes for something that had become weak. The late-era Simpsons relationship to celebrity guests is an admission, made repeatedly over many seasons, that the show no longer fully believes its own characters can carry an episode on their own. That is a significant thing for any show to implicitly confess. It suggests a creative exhaustion that goes deeper than any single bad episode or any single awkward guest appearance. The broader pattern here is one of a show that has been running so long that it has gradually replaced the things that made it genuinely good with the appearance of those things. Real stories became stories shaped around promotional opportunities. Real character work became formula. Real comedy became the reliable delivery of expected jokes. The celebrities arrive, they are funny, they leave, the show continues. Nothing changes, nothing is added. Nothing is said that was not already obvious before the episode began. Family Guy has its own creative limitations. It has seasons that felt like the show was spinning its wheels. It has episodes that went for shock value instead of genuine comedy. It has made creative decisions that frustrated even people who genuinely love the show. All of that is real and fair to acknowledge. But Family Guy has not spent 20 years building episodes around famous visitors to compensate for the hollowness at its own center. It has not had to, because its center is not hollow, and the evidence for that claim is not just in the emotional depth of the Brian and Stewie relationship, or in the streaming numbers, or in the show's survival through 2 cancellations. It is also in the very specific way the show has treated something that The Simpsons, over its 36 seasons, has almost completely refused to do. And that is the subject that makes the comparison between these two shows feel genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who grew up loving The Simpsons, because it requires admitting something that nostalgia makes very difficult to see clearly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Simpsons built its world on the premise that everything in Springfield stays the same. Characters do not age. Relationships do not fundamentally change. The town resets at the end of every episode. It was once a creative constraint the writers used cleverly. It became a prison. And the story of how Family Guy chose to handle the same constraint and what happened when it decided to break the rules entirely tells you more about the difference between these two shows than almost anything else. Section 10, the status quo problem, did why nothing in Springfield can ever change. There is a creative choice that almost every long-running animated show has to make at some point, and the choice reveals more about the show's relationship to its own characters than almost anything else. The choice is this: do you let things change, or do you keep everything the same? On one side of that choice is safety. If nothing changes, you never have to deal with the consequences of change. Characters stay familiar. The audience always knows what they are getting. The world of the show remains a comfortable place that viewers can return to whenever they want, knowing it will be exactly as they left it. The jokes can be written around established patterns, the stories can be constructed from known ingredients, everything is predictable in a way that feels, at least on the surface, like reliability. On the other side is risk. If things change, some viewers will not like the change. A character dying will upset the people who love that character. A relationship shifting will upset the people who were attached to how it was. A town or a world moving forward will leave behind the version of it that people fell in love with. Change is uncomfortable. Change requires the show to commit to something and live with the consequences of that commitment. The Simpsons chose safety so completely and so thoroughly that it did not just refuse to let things change. It built the refusal to change into the very structure of the show. After 36 seasons, Bart Simpson is still 10 years old, Lisa Simpson is still 8, Homer is still canonically in his late 30s. Maggie still has not learned to walk or talk in any episode that counts as part of the show's normal reality. The town of Springfield looks and functions essentially the same as it did in 1989. Characters who have died and been brought back include Frank Grimes Jr., appearing years after his father's death, but the core family and the core world remain locked in a permanent present tense where time does not pass and nothing accumulates. This was not always a problem. In the early seasons, the writers were so creative within the constraint that the constraint barely felt like one. They found ways to tell stories about change and consequence without actually changing anything permanently. Homer would learn something important about himself. The learning would feel real within the episode. Then the episode would end and the next one would begin fresh. It worked because the writing was good enough to make even temporary change feel meaningful. The emotional truth of the moment did not require the change to stick. You believed in it while it was happening, and that was enough. But there is a limit to how many times you can do that before the audience stops believing. There is a limit to how many times Homer can learn the same lesson about appreciating his family, how many times Bart can have a moment of genuine conscience, how many times Marge can be on the verge of leaving and then not leave, before the lack of real change stops feeling like a stylistic choice and starts feeling like a confession that the show has nothing new to say. That limit was reached somewhere around season 10 or 11 by most estimates. After that point, the reset at the end of every episode stopped being invisible and started being visible. Viewers began noticing that nothing they watched mattered because nothing ever led anywhere. The stories became less like stories and more like isolated events that happened in a world where events do not connect to each other. Springfield became less like a place where people lived and more like a stage set that got reassembled at the start of every episode because the previous episode's rearrangements needed to be undone. The most famous single example of this problem is the season 9 episode called The Principal and the Pauper. The episode reveals that Principal Skinner, who had been a main character in the show since its very beginning, is not actually Principal Skinner. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. He had been in the Vietnam War with the real Seymour Skinner, believed the real Skinner had died, came back to Springfield, and took over Skinner's identity because he had no identity of his own. The real Seymour Skinner then returns, reclaims his life, and Armin Tamzarian is about to be sent away forever when the town of Springfield decides they prefer the fake Skinner to the real one. The episode ends with a judge ordering everyone in Springfield to never speak of the incident again under penalty of torture. Harry Shearer, the voice actor who plays Principal Skinner and has been part of the show since its first season, publicly condemned the episode. He called it a disrespectful act toward the character and toward the audience that had spent years caring about who Skinner was. Critics agreed. The episode is consistently cited by fans and analysts as the moment the show most visibly revealed its willingness to erase years of character history for a single episode's twist, and then explicitly order itself and its audience to pretend it never happened. What makes the Principal and the Pauper particularly revealing is not just that it was a bad episode, it is that it treated the show's own history as disposable. Nearly a decade of audience understanding about who Principal Skinner was got thrown out for a plot device, and then got thrown back in again at the end when the plot device was inconvenient. The reset button was pressed so hard and so obviously that it became impossible to ignore. This was the show admitting in the most direct way possible that its characters did not have permanent identities. They had whatever identities the current episode needed them to have. Now look at what Family Guy has done with the same question of change and consequence. In season 12, in an episode called Life of Brian, Brian Griffin was killed. He was hit by a car in front of the Griffin house. He died on the way to the animal hospital, surrounded by the family. The episode did not treat this as a temporary inconvenience or a joke. It played it as a real loss. Stewie, who had no way to go back in time to save Brian because his time machine had been destroyed earlier in the episode, had to sit with what had happened. The family had to grieve. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, was introduced as a replacement. The audience reaction was enormous and immediate. Fans were genuinely upset. The response spread across social media, news outlets picked it up, and the conversation about Brian's death reached well beyond the show's regular fan base. People who had not watched Family Guy in years were talking about it. The strength of the reaction demonstrated clearly that Brian Griffin was not just a character people found funny. He was a character people had genuine emotional attachment to, the kind of attachment that only comes from years of consistent and carefully constructed storytelling. The show brought Brian back a few episodes later in a Christmas episode called Christmas Guy, in which Stewie travels back in time and saves Brian's life. The return was greeted with relief and happiness by the same audience that had been upset by the death. The whole arc lasted roughly 2 months in real broadcast time. Many critics noted that the death and return felt like a publicity stunt, a way to generate attention and conversation before inevitably reversing itself, and that criticism has some validity. But what is more important than whether the death was a stunt is what the whole situation revealed. Family Guy was willing to kill a main character. The Simpsons has never been willing to do anything remotely equivalent to one of its core cast. Family Guy was willing to let the absence of Brian be felt for multiple episodes, to sit inside that loss and explore what it meant to the characters who remained. The Simpsons resets after every episode as if nothing happened. Family Guy has also demonstrated a willingness to let characters change in ways that stick. Stewie Griffin is not the same character he was in Season 1. The world domination plots that defined his early characterization have largely been replaced by a more emotionally complex portrayal of a child who is extraordinarily intelligent, but also genuinely lonely, who needs Brian in ways that the show explores with real care, and whose relationship with the rest of his family has developed in directions the first season could not have predicted. This change was not announced or made dramatic. It happened gradually through individual episodes, and it accumulated into a genuinely different version of the character that is more interesting than the original. Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's core group of friends, was spun off into his own show called The Cleveland Show in 2009. He lived in that show for 4 seasons before the show was canceled in 2013. He then returned to Family Guy, bringing elements of what had happened to him in the spin-off back with him. His ex-wife Donna, his stepchildren Roberta and Rallo, and his biological son Cleveland Jr. all became part of the Family Guy world after the spin-off ended. The show absorbed the consequences of its own spin-off rather than pretending the spin-off had not happened. That is a show behaving as if its own history matters. The Simpsons spin-off question is more complicated, because the show did not produce a direct character spin-off in the same way, but the show's relationship to its own continuity has become increasingly strained over its later seasons. Characters have done things that contradict what was established about them in earlier seasons. Backstory details have been introduced that do not match what the show had previously shown. The town of Springfield has been described as being in different American states at different times. These are not large individual problems. They accumulate into a general feeling that the show has been running for so long that the people currently making it do not have a complete and consistent picture of the world they are working inside. There is a specific detail about the Simpsons status quo problem that is worth sitting with. After 36 seasons, Homer Simpson has had, by the show's own count across all those episodes, dozens of different jobs. He has been a food critic, a snowplow driver, a bodyguard, a country music manager, a missionary, a monorail conductor, and many more. Every one of these jobs lasted one episode and then disappeared. The show has a recurring joke structure built around Homer getting a new job, the job being the premise of the episode, and then the job being gone by the time the next episode starts. This joke structure, which was funny the first several times it appeared, has become a confession of the show's deepest problem. Nothing Homer does has consequences. Nothing he experiences changes anything about who he is or what his life looks like. He is a man permanently frozen in the same life, cycling through events that leave no mark on him. Peter Griffin has also had different jobs across Family Guy's run. He started the show working at a toy factory, then moved to the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, and has had various other situations across different episodes, but the show does not cycle through new jobs for Peter as a recurring structural joke the way The Simpsons does with Homer. Peter's employment history is not a format. It is just a part of the show's world that has moved around over time in ways that mostly make sense given the kind of person Peter is. The status quo problem in The Simpsons is not going to be fixed. The show is too old, has too many episodes, and has too much commercial investment in the version of itself that it has been for the past 25 years to make any real structural change at this point. The characters will stay the same age they have always been. The stories will reset at the end of every episode. The lessons will be learned and forgotten. The reset button will be pressed. This is not inherently a moral failure. Every long-running animated show has to make peace with some version of this problem, but The Simpsons has been pressing the reset button for so long, so hard, and so visibly that it has become the defining feature of the show's current identity in a way that undercuts almost everything the show tries to do. When nothing changes, nothing matters. And when nothing matters, the audience eventually realizes it has been watching a very expensive habit rather than a show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What is left when you take away the illusion that the stories matter is the question of whether the show can still make you laugh, and that brings us to the part of the Simpsons decline that hurts the most to look at directly, because it involves not just what the show lost in terms of character and story, but what it lost in terms of the specific people who sat in the room and decided which jokes were good enough to keep. The next section is about who those people were, what happened to them, and what the show has been doing since they left. Section 11, the generational shift, who is actually watching these shows. There is a version of The Simpsons versus Family Guy debate that gets decided by age. Ask someone who was between 8 and 14 years old in 1993 which show is better, and the answer is almost always The Simpsons. Ask someone who was between 8 and 14 years old in 2003, and the answer is almost always Family Guy. These are not random preferences. They are the result of a very specific and very traceable set of circumstances that shaped how two different generations of viewers first encountered adult animated television, what they expected from it, and which show became the reference point against which they measured everything else. Understanding this generational split does not mean dismissing either group's preference as merely nostalgic. It means understanding what each show actually was at the moment it reached its audience, and what that means for which show is more alive and more relevant to the people watching television right now in 2025 and 2026. The Simpsons reached its core audience during a very specific cultural moment. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a period when adult animated television essentially did not exist as a category. Cartoons were for children, they aired on Saturday mornings, they had simple stories, simple characters, and simple humor. The idea that an animated show could be made for adults, could deal with complex family dynamics and social commentary, and layered jokes that worked differently for viewers of different ages was not just unusual. It was essentially unprecedented in American primetime television. The Simpsons changed that. When it premiered in December 1989, it was genuinely unlike anything that had been on American television before. Families watching it together discovered that the adults were laughing at different things than the children, that the show was operating on multiple levels simultaneously, that it was possible for animation to be smart and sophisticated and funny in ways that had never been attempted on prime time before. The cultural impact was immediate and enormous. Bart Simpson was on every piece of merchandise imaginable within months. The show's catchphrases became part of everyday conversation. Teachers and parents complained about it. George H.W. Bush mentioned it negatively in a speech about American family values in January 1992. And the show's writers produced a response that aired 3 days later in which Bart said that The Simpsons were just like the Waltons, praying for an end to the Depression. The generation that grew up watching The Simpsons in its golden years, roughly seasons 3 through 8, was experiencing something genuinely new. They were watching a show that respected their intelligence, that rewarded close attention, that felt like it was written by people who genuinely cared about making something excellent. They absorbed the show's rhythms and sensibilities at an age when the things you love tend to leave the deepest impressions. The Simpsons became, for that generation, not just a favorite show, but a primary reference point for what comedy could be. When they say The Simpsons is better than Family Guy, what they are often really saying is that nothing has ever felt the way The Simpsons felt when they were young and the show was at its best. That feeling is real. It is just not the same thing as the show being good right now. Family Guy reached its core audience a decade later and under completely different circumstances. By 1999, The Simpsons had already been on television for 10 years. Adult animated shows were no longer a novelty. South Park had premiered in 1997 and it immediately established that adult animation could be darker and more provocative than The Simpsons was willing to be. The category had expanded, audiences had more choices and higher tolerance for edgier material. Family Guy walked into a world where adult animation already existed and had already been pushed in multiple directions. The initial Family Guy audience was modest. The show found its footing but was not a phenomenon in the way The Simpsons had been in its first years. The cancellations and the Adult Swim reruns that followed changed everything about who was actually watching the show. When Family Guy reruns began airing on Adult Swim between 2003 and 2005, the audience they found was made up primarily of teenagers and young adults who were up late at night watching cable television. Many of these viewers had been too young to watch Family Guy during its original Fox run. They were discovering the show for the first time through syndication, and they were doing so without the weight of expectation that came with being longtime Simpsons fans. They were not comparing Family Guy to a show they had grown up loving. They were just watching something that was funny and strange and willing to go to places that other shows would not go. This audience became the foundation of Family Guy's revival. They were the ones buying the DVDs. They were the ones signing the petitions. They were the ones watching the Adult Swim reruns in large enough numbers that Fox noticed. When the show came back in 2005, it came back to an audience that was younger, more online, and more engaged than the audience that had watched it the first time. And that audience grew up with Family Guy as their primary animated comedy reference point. in the same way the previous generation had grown up with The Simpsons. By 2025, this generational dynamic has produced a situation that is visible in the streaming data in a very clear way. Family Guy's audience is predominantly made up of viewers under 35. These are the people who are the core demographic for streaming services. They are the people whose viewing habits Nielsen tracks most carefully because they represent the future of the entertainment business. And these people are watching Family Guy in historically large numbers, as demonstrated by the 42.44 billion viewing minutes on Hulu in 2024 that placed the show third in the country across all platforms. The Simpsons audience has aged with the show. The viewers who loved the golden era are now in their 40s and 50s. Many of them still carry affection for the show, but their active engagement with new episodes has dropped dramatically, as evidenced by the 1.2 million average viewers per episode in the show's most recent seasons, compared to 14.4 million at its peak. The generation that loved The Simpsons most deeply is not watching new episodes. They are occasionally rewatching old ones. The show's ability to attract new young viewers who will become genuinely invested in it has been severely limited by the fact that new episodes are not good enough to compete with the enormous catalog of entertainment available to a young viewer in 2025. There is also the question of how each show reaches new audiences in the current media landscape. This was touched on in earlier sections in the context of the streaming numbers, but the generational dimension of it deserves its own examination. Family Guy's cutaway format, as was discussed in Section 7, produces individual clips that are perfectly sized for social media and short-form video platforms. TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, and similar platforms are where a significant portion of comedy discovery happens for viewers under 25. When a funny Family Guy clip appears in someone's feed, they do not need any prior knowledge of the show to find it funny. The joke is self-contained, it works on its own. If they find it funny enough, they go looking for more. Some of them eventually find their way to the full show on Hulu and become regular viewers. The Simpsons does not benefit from this dynamic in the same way. The show's best moments, the ones that are actually worth sharing, come from episodes that are 25 to 30 years old. When a Simpsons clip goes viral on social media, it is almost always a clip from the golden era. Steamed Hams, the short segment from the Season 7 Episode 22, short films about Springfield in which Principal Skinner tries to convince Superintendent Chalmers that the fast food he ordered is actually a home-cooked meal, became one of the most widely shared and remixed pieces of Simpsons content on the internet in the mid-2000s. It was from 1996. The meme era rediscovery of Golden Simpsons content has been one of the most interesting cultural phenomena of the past decade, with younger viewers discovering just how good the show was before they were born. But that rediscovery is not translating into viewership of the current show. Young viewers who discover Steamed Hams and fall in love with it do not then become regular watchers of Season 35. They watch more clips from the 1990s episodes. They maybe watch some full episodes from Seasons 4 and 5. They do not connect with the show as it currently exists because the show as it currently exists does not operate at anything close to the level of the material they discovered. Family Guy does not have this problem in the same way. A young viewer who discovers a funny Family Guy clip from Season 18 can watch Season 18 on Hulu and find more episodes of similar quality. The gap between the best Family Guy content that exists online and the quality of current Family Guy episodes is much smaller than the gap between the best Simpsons content that exists online and the quality of current Simpsons episodes. This makes Family Guy a much easier show to become a fan of in 2025 if you are coming to it fresh. Seth MacFarlane's social media presence and his public persona have also contributed to keeping Family Guy relevant to younger audiences in ways that Matt Groening's relative withdrawal from public life has not done for The Simpsons. MacFarlane is active and visible. The show feels like it has a person behind it who is still paying attention. Groening has moved on to other projects, most notably the Netflix animated series Disenchantment, and his relationship to The Simpsons in its current form is distant in a way that is sometimes acknowledged publicly. There is one more generational element worth addressing directly, which is the question of what each show taught its audience about what comedy was allowed to do and where it was allowed to go. The generation that grew up with Golden Era Simpsons learned that animated comedy could be emotionally sophisticated, could deal with real human feelings, could make you laugh, and then make you feel something more complicated within the same episode. That was a real and valuable lesson that those viewers have carried with them. The generation that grew up with Family Guy learned something different. They learned that animated comedy could be genuinely transgressive, could go places that made you uncomfortable, could use shock and absurdity as tools for saying things that more polished shows could not say. They learned that a show did not have to be respectable to be worth watching. They learned that sometimes the most honest thing a comedy can do is refuse to behave. Neither lesson is more correct than the other. They are just different things that two different shows taught two different groups of people at two different moments in history. The question of which lesson matters more right now in the current media landscape for the current audience is not hard to answer when you look at which show those people are actually choosing to spend their time with. The generational shift in who watches these shows is not a temporary situation that will reverse itself. It reflects something permanent about what each show became and what each show now represents. The Simpsons represents a past that was genuinely extraordinary and a present that has not come close to matching it. Family Guy represents a past that was rougher and less celebrated, and a present that is, by the measurements that matter, more vital and more watched than almost anyone predicted it would be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What remains is the hardest question of all. When you look at everything we have examined across these 11 sections, when you hold the full history of both shows in your head at the same time and try to give an honest answer about which one is better, the answer requires separating two things that most people in this debate have never successfully pulled apart: what both shows left behind and what each one actually is. Section 12, the legacy question. What each show actually left behind. This is the section where the honest version of this argument has to do something uncomfortable. It has to admit something that the previous 11 sections, in making the case for Family Guy, have been building toward but have not yet said directly. And that thing is this: The Simpsons is one of the greatest creative achievements in the history of American television. Not one of the greatest animated shows, one of the greatest shows, full stop, across every genre, every format, every era of television that has ever existed. That is not a debatable claim. It is the consensus of critics, academics, cultural historians, and the people who have spent the most time studying what television can do and what it has done. Time magazine named it the greatest television series of the 20th century, not the greatest animated series, the greatest series, period. Saying that Family Guy is better than The Simpsons requires being honest about what that statement means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that Family Guy is a greater achievement in the history of the medium. It does not mean that Family Guy changed television the way The Simpsons changed television. It does not mean that Family Guy produced anything in its run that reached the level of a Season 4 or Season 5 Simpsons episode at its absolute peak. None of those things are true, and this essay has never claimed they were. What the statement means and what this essay has been building a case for across 12 sections is something more specific and more honest than a simple ranking. It means that when you look at both shows as complete works across their full runs, when you measure them not just at their best, but across everything they have done from their first episode to their most recent one, and when you apply that measurement to the shows as they actually exist in 2025 and 2026, rather than as they existed in the memories of people who grew up watching them, Family Guy holds up better. It is more consistent, it is more alive, it is more watched, and it has demonstrated repeatedly and measurably that it still has something worth watching happening inside it. That is the argument. Now let us look at what each show actually left behind, because legacy is not just about what a show was at its best. It is about what it did to the world around it, what it made possible, and what it means to the people who carry it with them. The Simpsons changed everything. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not nostalgia. Before The Simpsons Premiered on December 17, 1989, adult animated television in American prime time did not exist as a category. The show created the category. Every adult animated show that came after it, including Family Guy, owes its existence to the fact that The Simpsons proved the format was viable, that it could attract large audiences, that it could be taken seriously as a piece of creative work, and that networks would invest in it. Without The Simpsons, there is no South Park. Without The Simpsons, there is no Futurama. Without The Simpsons, there is almost certainly no Family Guy. Family Guy's own creators acknowledged this directly and without embarrassment. In the episode called Family Guy Viewer, Male Number 2, the character Stewie states on screen that Family Guy is based on the American sitcom The Simpsons. And in another episode, Peter Griffin confesses to his family that they stole a lot from The Simpsons. These are not subtle background jokes. They are explicit on-screen acknowledgments by the show's own characters, written by the show's own writers, that Family Guy was built on the foundation that The Simpsons laid. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that The Simpsons and All in the Family were among the primary inspirations he drew from when creating Family Guy. The debt is real and it is openly admitted. The Simpsons also produced, during its golden years, some of the most carefully crafted individual episodes in the history of comedy television. Marge versus the Monorail from Season 4, written by Conan O'Brien before he became one of the most famous talk show hosts in America, is a masterpiece of escalating absurdity built on a real emotional foundation. Homer at the Bat from Season 3 packed more celebrity cameos into a single episode than almost any show before or since and made every single one of them funny and purposeful. Last Exit to Springfield from Season 4 is regularly cited by critics as one of the greatest television episodes ever produced in any genre, a story about a labor strike at the nuclear plant that works simultaneously as a labor rights commentary, a parody of organized crime films, a father-daughter story, and a collection of some of the most densely packed jokes in the show's history. Cape Fear from Season 5, the episode in which Sideshow Bob repeatedly steps on rakes after chasing the Simpsons to a houseboat, contains a sequence so committed to a single absurdist premise that it has been analyzed in film schools as an example of pure comedic timing taken to its logical extreme. These episodes are real achievements. They deserve every piece of praise they have received. The generation that grew up watching them was genuinely lucky to have them, and the fact that those episodes still hold up completely when watched today, 30 years after they were made, is proof of how carefully they were constructed. Family Guy has not produced anything that sits comfortably alongside Last Exit to Springfield or Cape Fear, or Marge versus the Monorail at the very top of what animated comedy has achieved. Road to Rhode Island is a wonderful episode. Brian and Stewie is a genuinely brave piece of television. Road to the Multiverse is formally inventive in ways that most animated shows would not attempt. And Then There Were Fewer is a genuinely constructed mystery that earns its 45-minute running time. These are good episodes. They are not in the same conversation as the absolute best of what The Simpsons produced between 1991 and 1997. But here is what is also true. The Simpsons has not produced anything in that conversation either for the past 25 years. The last time The Simpsons was operating at the level of its greatest episodes, Bill Clinton was in his first term as president. The World Wide Web had existed for less than 5 years. Family Guy had not yet been pitched to Fox. The show that produced those masterpiece episodes is not the show that exists today in any meaningful creative sense. The writers are different, the sensibility is different, the ambition is different, the results are different. The show shares a name and a set of characters with the show that made those episodes, but the connection between the two is increasingly superficial. What Family Guy's legacy looks like is different in kind, but not necessarily smaller in importance. Family Guy proved that a show could be canceled twice and still come back stronger. It proved that audience loyalty expressed through DVD sales and petition signatures and syndication viewing could change the decision of a major television network. It was the first show in American television history to be revived primarily because of home video sales and online fan activity. That sounds like a minor footnote, but it is not. It changed how networks and studios thought about the relationship between cancellation and audience demand. It made possible a world in which fan campaigns to save canceled shows are taken seriously by the industry, a world in which streaming services look at secondary market data before making renewal decisions, a world in which a show does not necessarily end just because a network decides it does. Family Guy also proved that the cutaway format, dismissed by critics as lazy and by the traditional comedy establishment as unworthy of serious attention, could sustain a show for over 20 seasons and place that show at the top of the national streaming charts a quarter century after it first aired. The format that everyone agreed was the wrong way to make a comedy show turned out to be one of the most durable and most adaptable formats in the history of the medium. Individual cutaway clips are still being discovered by new viewers today, still being shared across social platforms, still bringing new people to the show. The format created a kind of content that essentially never goes stale because each piece of it is self-contained and context-free. That is an accidental but real contribution to how comedy distributes itself in the digital age. In December 2025, Disney announced that Family Guy was among the shows to surpass 1 billion hours streamed on Disney Plus in 2025. In January 2026, Seth MacFarlane received the inaugural Streaming Icon of the Year award from Nielsen for generating over 60 billion viewing minutes across all platforms during 2025. In March 2026, a 2-season order was announced for a spin-off series called Stewie, set to premiere during the 2027 to 2028 television season. The show is not winding down, it is expanding. It is producing a spin-off centered on the character whose relationship with Brian has been the emotional heart of the series for over 20 years. The spin-off was not ordered because the franchise is exhausted. It was ordered because the audience for these characters is large enough and engaged enough to support an entirely new series built around one of them. The Simpsons was renewed in April 2025 through season 40. It will still be producing new episodes in 2028 or 2029. By that point, it will have been on the air for nearly 40 years. There are people alive today who were not yet born when The Simpsons premiered who will be watching new episodes of it. The show will continue as long as Disney and Fox determine that the brand value of continuing it outweighs the cost of producing it. That calculation has remained in the show's favor for 36 years and shows no immediate sign of changing. But a show continuing is not the same as a show mattering. A franchise asset and a great television show are two different things, and The Simpsons has been one more than the other for a long time now. The show that changed television, that created an entire category, that produced some of the most carefully made comedy episodes in the history of the medium, reached its greatest heights between roughly 1991 and 1997. What has come since is not that show. It is the institutional continuation of that show's identity, managed by people who respect its history but cannot replicate its genius, sustained by brand recognition and commercial inertia, rather than by anything happening inside the episodes themselves. Family Guy is not The Simpsons. It was never going to be The Simpsons. It did not try to be The Simpsons, even when its own characters were openly admitting how much of it they had taken from The Simpsons. What it tried to be, and what it has succeeded at being more consistently and more durably than most people who dismissed it ever predicted, is itself. A loud, crude, frequently surprising, occasionally genuinely moving, persistently watchable show that earned its audience the hard way, kept that audience through 2 cancellations and a quarter century of production, and is still generating 1 billion hours of streaming per year in 2025. When someone asks which show is better, the honest answer is that the question has 2 parts. Which show was greater at its absolute best? The Simpsons, and it is not close. Which show is better right now across its full run as a living piece of television that people are actively choosing to watch? Family Guy, and that is not particularly close either. Both things can be true. The Simpsons built the house. Family Guy has been living in it more comfortably for the past 20 years than the people who built it have. That is not a dismissal of what The Simpsons was. It is an honest accounting of what both shows are. The argument has been made across 12 sections. The evidence has been laid out, the streaming numbers, the character analysis, the writing room history, the cancellation and resurrection story, the emotional depth of the Brian and Stewie relationship, the generational shift in who is watching, the guest star problem, the status quo problem, the Flanderization of an entire cast, the decline of the show's most important character. All of it points in the same direction. The Simpsons is one of the greatest shows ever made. Family Guy is the better show to watch right now. Holding both of those sentences in your head at the same time, without letting one cancel the other out, is the most honest thing anyone has said about this debate in a very long time. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.